Hey guys! Tonight we're slipping into the strange corners of Greek mythology, the places the big names don't usually shine. No Zeus throwing lightning bolts, no Hera stirring jealous storms, none of the Olympian drama you've probably already heard 100 times. Instead, you're drifting into the half-forgotten tales, the ones that feel like shadows cast just outside the torchlight of history. Picture it. You're stretched out, the room is dark, maybe just a faint glow from the screen. Outside, the night air is still, heavy, and the only sound is your breath keeping rhythm. And here, in this quiet, the voices of old myths are softer too, fragile, cracked at the edges, but still echoing. Some of these myths are odd, even unsettling, but they have the kind of dreamlike weight that makes your eyelids heavier the longer you listen. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps more than you realize, and it lets me keep weaving these endless stories to guide you into rest. Drop your location and the local time in the comments too. It's always fascinating to see where in the world everyone is listening from. Now dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the twilight of myth, where the borders between memory and imagination blur. This isn't Athens with its polished temples or Olympus with its gleaming halls. Instead, you find yourself wandering a dim path overgrown with vines where forgotten gods whisper from the underbrush. They're the kind of gods who never made it into the big epics, gods without marble statues or famous hymns. You sense their presence in the rustle of leaves, in the flicker of fireflies, in the way your own shadow feels a little too long beneath the moon. Here, the world isn't orderly. It's not about law or grand battles, but about strange punishments, peculiar gifts, and tragedies that cling like dew. One step takes you into the story of a girl who loved too deeply and became a tree. Another step, and you brush against a man who could listen to snakes and learn the secrets of the earth. And in the distance, a darker trail leads you toward a banquet where a king tried to fool Zeus himself, and in that single act gave birth to the first werewolf. You feel the weight of these tales pressing softly against your mind. They're heavy with symbols, with hidden meanings, but you don't need to untangle them. All you have to do is drift, to let the cadence of the stories carry you like a small boat on a wide, slow river. And as you walk deeper into this twilight forest of myths, you notice something strange. They don't feel foreign. They feel familiar, like half-remembered dreams you can't place. Maybe you've brushed against these tales before, buried in a book or hidden in a passing conversation. But now, they're alive again, standing beside you, inviting you to follow. The night grows cooler. You breathe it in. Somewhere behind you, the modern world is fading. No clocks ticking, no notifications, no bright lights. Just silence and the pull of stories that have lingered for thousands of years, waiting for someone like you to listen. What makes these stories different is that they were never the popular hits. They weren't carved into temple walls or sung at grand festivals. These are the myths that survived, like seeds tucked away in the soil. Stories passed through whispers, scraps of papyrus, or retellings that drifted into medieval texts. Some are fragments, barely more than a name or a sentence. Others are complete enough to feel like miniature tragedies, raw and human. You may not hear about them in school, but that's part of their charm. They feel secret, personal, almost like they were written just for you. And tonight, in this quiet, they belong to you alone. There's something almost mischievous about slipping past Zeus and Apollo to spend the evening with lesser-known figures. You're like a guest sneaking away from the banquet table to explore the hidden rooms of the palace. And what you find there isn't always neat or noble. Sometimes it's strange. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. But it's always real. Think about it. Greek mythology isn't just about gods commanding thunder or heroes swinging swords. It's also about the fragility of being human, the quirks of fate, the absurdity of divine punishments. These little myths are like the B-sides of an old album, not chart toppers, but the kind of songs that stick with you late at night, looping in your head, refusing to leave. And maybe that's why they work so well here, in the soft glow of a video meant to lull you into sleep. The mainstream stories are too loud, too familiar. They demand attention. But these are quieter. They're stories that don't mind if you drift in and out, catching pieces before your eyelids slip shut. They'll wait for you. They've been waiting for centuries. Imagine, for example, a myth about a man who could speak to animals because he once overheard snakes whispering secrets. You don't need to grasp every detail. It's the image that lingers. A human bending close to the earth, listening as if the soil itself had something to say. Strange, yes, but strangely calming too. Or picture a banquet where Zeus himself sits at the head of the table. The food is rich, the wine endless, the laughter loud. But then one guest offers a dish that is not what it seems. The trickery is dark, the consequences darker still, and from that night forward, the shadow of the first werewolf slinks into legend. It's not a jump scare story. It's more like the kind of unsettling dream that leaves you waking slowly, wondering if it ever really happened. And then, almost like a whisper, the story of a girl whose longing turned into bark and roots. You can see her there, her arms stretching into branches, her tears crystallizing into amber. Sad, haunting, but somehow gentle, like a lullaby hummed in a language you don't quite understand. These are the stories waiting ahead of you, a quiet garden of strange myths, each one blooming in its own peculiar shape. And for tonight, all you need to do is wander with me through this garden step by step until the paths blur into dreams. You step into the quiet hush of ancient Greece, and the air itself feels different, thicker, older, as if time had slowed to a crawl. Imagine you're wandering through narrow dirt paths that coil between olive groves, the moonlight spilling silver over leaves that sway with an almost hypnotic rhythm. This is where myths are born, not in palaces or on battlefields, but in the hush of rural villages and the murmurs of fireside storytellers. The world here is more intimate, less polished than the grand epics, and it's in this humbler soil that strange stories take root. The Greeks didn't think of their myths as bedtime tales the way we do now. To them, these were explanations. Why trees grow the way they do, why storms roar, why human emotions can feel so overpowering. Every little twist of nature or life could be connected to a myth, a story that shaped the way they saw the world. It's almost like their entire landscape was alive with voices. Rivers weren't just water, they were gods. Mountains weren't just rocks, they were sleeping titans. Even your shadow could be explained as a presence lingering just a step behind. Now, when you hear Greek mythology, your mind probably jumps straight to the Olympians, Those headline names that dominated stories. Zeus with his thunderbolts, Poseidon stirring the seas, Athena plotting her clever schemes. But those were the celebrities. Beneath their glittering stage presence were countless minor figures. Mortals cursed, nymphs forgotten, kings punished for their arrogance. These were the stories whispered rather than shouted, but they carried the same weight, sometimes even more. Think of it like modern pop culture. Everyone knows the blockbusters, the Marvel movies, the chart-topping songs, but tucked away are indie films or quiet novels that may never dominate headlines, yet they resonate deeply with a smaller, attentive audience. That's what these obscure myths are. They didn't dominate festivals, but they crept into the corners of conversations, shaping local rituals, influencing how people thought about morality, fate, and the strange humor of the gods. And here's the fascinating part. The line between myth and history wasn't rigid for the Greeks. They didn't say, this is a fairy tale and this is a fact. Instead, myths were a living explanation of their reality. If you lived in a village where wolves prowled the forests, the story of Lycaon becoming a wolf didn't sound like a bedtime spook. It felt like a warning that the wild had a will of its own. Take a moment and imagine living back then. No glowing screens, no street lights, just the dim warmth of fire against endless night. The darkness outside your door was filled with sounds you couldn't explain. Cracks of branches, distant howls, winds that whispered through trees. Wouldn't you believe the world was alive with spirits? That every rustle could be a god watching? That a strange illness, a storm, or even an overwhelming desire might be the work of something divine?
That's why myths mattered so much. They weren't abstract. They were practical. They gave you a way to live in harmony with a world that often felt unpredictable. If lightning struck your field, you didn't just curse the weather. You wondered which god you had upset. If you felt a sudden longing you couldn't control, you didn't call it psychology. You thought of it as Aphrodite's influence, or perhaps a punishment from the fates. Now, among these countless tales, some of the strangest involve transformation. Humans turned into animals, trees, even stones. These metamorphoses weren't just fantastical plot twists. They carried meaning. To the Greeks, changing shape meant crossing a boundary between the human and the divine, between the ordinary and the eternal. It was both terrifying and sacred. And so, in this dim, myth-soaked landscape, 3 stories shimmer out of the shadows, waiting for you. First, the tale of Myrrha, a young woman whose forbidden desires spiraled into tragedy, ending not with death, but with transformation. Her body rooted into the soil, her tears crystallized into sap. A myth both sorrowful and strangely beautiful, like a tree forever crying in silence. Then there's Melampus, the man who could hear animals speak. Imagine that, understanding the secret gossip of birds, the whispered warnings of snakes, the laughter of goats. His story is part curiosity, part comedy, part mystical insight, and it reveals just how fluid the boundary between human and animal was in Greek thought. And finally, lurking in the deepest shadow, the tale of Lycaon, a king who dared to test Zeus with an act so grotesque that the god's fury reshaped him entirely, body and soul. From this myth was born the very first werewolf, a creature that prowls not just Greek imagination, but human imagination across centuries. Each of these myths is strange. Each of them is unsettling, but they all hold a mirror to human nature. The things we long for, the things we fear, and the things we can't explain. So as you drift here in the hush of the night, think of yourself as a guest at an ancient hearth. The stars are above you, the earth is beneath you, and the air is alive with stories. The elders lean closer, their voices low and steady. Their words carry the weight of centuries, and though you may not remember every detail come morning, the rhythm of these tales will guide you gently into sleep. And perhaps as you begin to close your eyes, you'll feel it too, that strange pull between the human and the divine, the ordinary and the mythic, where every sound, every shadow, every dream might hold a story waiting to be told.
The story of Myrrha begins in silence, as so many Greek tragedies do. You picture yourself in a small palace chamber, lit only by the flicker of oil lamps. The shadows are long, wavering against painted walls. The air smells faintly of resin and honey, heavy and still, as though even the night itself is holding its breath before the storm arrives. And in that hush, you meet her. Not yet a myth, not yet a symbol, but simply a daughter. Myrrha, also called Smyrna in some traditions, was a princess of Cyprus. Her father, King Snaras, was wealthy and powerful, a man whose kingdom thrives under the sun of the Mediterranean. Her mother was proud, perhaps a little too proud. Myrrha herself was graceful and striking, the kind of beauty that ancient storytellers liked to place at the center of their cautionary tales. From the outside, her life seemed gilded, shimmering like a vase in the sunlight. But Greek myth always knew how to find the cracks in perfection. And it is within those cracks that the darkest stories take root. The Greeks never shied away from uncomfortable subjects. In fact, they seemed almost to relish them, using extremes to teach lessons or to unsettle the mind into reflection. And Myrrha's story, well, it sits near the top of the list of unsettling myths. It tells of desire twisted into cruelty, of love corrupted into torment. Some versions blame the gods directly. They say Aphrodite herself, furious at Myrrha's mother for boasting that her daughter was more beautiful than the goddess, cursed the girl with a forbidden passion. Others insist it was the Furies, those shadowy spirits of vengeance, who planted the seed of ruin in her heart. However you frame it, the myth insists on one truth. This was no ordinary love. It was compulsion, divine punishment disguised as desire.
Imagine her nights. You see her lying awake in her chamber, staring at the ceiling beams, her chest tight with a dread she cannot name aloud. Servants whisper in the halls. Her father drifts off to royal duties. The city beyond sleeps in peace. And she is trapped inside a war waged by forces she cannot fight. She prays to the gods, but the very deities who cursed her remain silent. What hope does a mortal have when even prayer becomes a cage? Here's the curious thing. Greek mythology didn't tell these stories just to shock. They served as warnings, as mirrors reflecting human pride, folly, or frailty. Myrrha's tale isn't really about her alone. It's about the dangers of boasting against the gods, the fragility of boundaries, and the devastating weight of shame. When love turns against you, when the divine decides to make you a lesson, the result is never gentle. As the myth goes, her secret could not remain hidden forever. In the stillness of the palace, secrecy became a shadowy companion. For nights, she crept through its halls, cloaked in darkness, until at last the truth slipped into the open. Her father's reaction was swift and merciless. Cinyras, horrified, raised his sword at her. And so she fled, barefoot into the wilderness, chased by rage and shame, the gods watching from above like distant, pitiless stars.
Now here comes the part that cements this tale in memory. Myrrha, hunted and broken, reached a breaking point. She lifted her voice, not in rebellion, not in confession, but in a desperate plea. She asked not for forgiveness, not for triumph, but simply for release. And, for once, the gods listened. Perhaps they pitied her, or perhaps they simply decided her suffering had made its point. Whatever the reason, they transformed her. Her body stiffened, her skin hardened into bark, her arms stretched upward, reaching for the sky. And in her place, rooted in the soil of sorrow, stood a tree. The first myrrh tree. It's a haunting image, isn't it? A young woman dissolving into wood, her sorrow sealed beneath layers of bark, her tears turned into resin. Even today, when you hear the word myrrh, you might think of nativity stories or ancient medicine. But here, in this myth, every drop of that fragrant resin is something more. It is grief, crystallized into something sweet and bitter at once. And here's where history and myth entwine. In the ancient world, myrrh was precious. It was used to make perfumes that lingered softly in the air, medicines that soothed pain, and incense that curled into temple rafters during sacred rites. It even played a role in embalming, preserving bodies for journeys into the afterlife. To the Greeks, to the Egyptians, to the Hebrews, this resin was more than a scent. It was sacred. So when they told the story of Myrrha, they weren't just inventing tragedy. They were giving meaning to the sweetness and sharpness of a tree's tears. Think about it. Next time you catch the earthy sweet fragrance of resin, imagine it as the sorrow of a girl who begged for release. To the Greeks, nature itself was a storybook. Every tree, every stone, every river, hiding some divine drama. The myrrh tree? A monument to suffering transformed into beauty. And let's pause for a lighter thought. You've got to wonder how ancient storytellers explained this around the fire. And that's why this tree drips perfume, they'd say, while children's eyes widened. Imagine explaining that to your kids at bedtime today. Yes, dear, the perfume you're wearing comes from the tears of a cursed princess. That's one way to make sure nobody borrows your cologne without asking. But the story doesn't end at transformation. Even in her wooden stillness, Myrrha gave birth to a son, Adonis, the mortal so beautiful that Aphrodite herself would fall in love with him. From tragedy came a new story, another branch in the endless tree of Greek myth. Myrrha's suffering became the root of a tale that would echo for centuries, connecting gods, mortals, and the eternal struggle between love and loss. So here you sit, centuries later, tracing her sorrow like resin down the bark of time. Myrrha's story is not gentle, not comforting, yet in its way, it is strangely eternal. It reminds you that grief can turn into legacy, despair into something enduring. Out of pain, sometimes, comes beauty. Out of silence, a story. And as you imagine that tree swaying in the night, resin glinting like moonlit tears, your mind softens. The forest around it grows quieter, the shadows lengthen, and somewhere beyond, another story waits to take its turn.
You linger with the image of the tree, Myrrha's sorrow dripping like resin in the moonlight. The silence is thick, the kind of stillness where you can hear the weight of your own breath. But in Greek myth, silence never lasts long. It is always broken by consequence, by transformation, by the unexpected. And so from that tree, from Myrrha's still body, came a child. His name would become a legend in its own right, Adonis. Now, Adonis is a name that's drifted into modern language, a shorthand for male beauty. You hear someone say, an Adonis, and you picture a striking face, flawless features, maybe the kind of person who somehow always has perfect lighting in selfies. But in the myth, his beauty was not just surface level. It was divine magnetism, the kind that pulled gods themselves into orbit. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, looked at him and forgot her immortal dignity. She wanted him. She loved him. And because she was Aphrodite, her love was not a quiet thing. It was a force that bent the world around her. Here's where the tragedy threads itself again. Because in Greek myth, love is never safe. It is powerful, consuming, often destructive. For Adonis, beauty was both a blessing and a curse. He was loved so fiercely by Aphrodite that she kept him hidden in a chest when he was still an infant, placing him in the care of Persephone, queen of the underworld. You can imagine Persephone opening that chest, seeing this impossibly radiant child, and thinking, "Really, Aphrodite, you want me to babysit this kid?" And sure enough, Persephone fell for him too. What followed was a divine custody battle. Aphrodite wanted him. Persephone refused to give him back. The gods had to intervene, and eventually Zeus, or in some versions another mediator, decided that Adonis would split his time. A portion of the year with Persephone in the underworld, a portion with Aphrodite above, and a portion free to himself. It's oddly reminiscent of a very ancient divine joint custody arrangement. But the story darkens again when Adonis grows older. His beauty draws him toward the thrill of the hunt. He becomes a young man roaming forests, chasing wild animals, spear in hand, muscles taut with effort, sunlight glinting on his skin. And despite Aphrodite's desperate warnings, he cannot resist. She begged him not to hunt dangerous beasts, not to test fate, not to place that perfect life at risk. Yet, of course, this is a Greek myth. And in Greek myths, warnings are less advice and more spoilers. One day, Adonis hunted a wild boar. The creature charged, tusks flashing like ivory blades, and before he could escape, it gored him. The blood poured into the earth, staining the soil red. Aphrodite rushed to him frantic, her tears falling as she tried to save him. But his body lay still, too fragile even for divine love to protect. Out of his blood sprang a flower, the anemone, delicate and red as spilled wine. His story, like his mother's, ended in transformation, sorrow reborn as beauty.
There's a curious echo here, isn't there? Myrrha became a tree, her tears turned into resin, her son, Adonis, died and became a flower, his blood blossoming into petals. In both stories, human suffering is made eternal by the natural world. The Greeks seem to delight in folding tragedy into the very fabric of earth. Trees, flowers, rivers, stones, so that every step through nature became a reminder of myth. It's as if the landscape itself whispered stories, waiting for you to listen. And if you look closer, there's another thread weaving these stories together. Both Myrrha and Adonis are bound to Aphrodite. Myrrha's suffering began with the goddess's curse. Her son's beauty sparked Aphrodite's consuming love. It's almost as if the family was doomed to orbit Venus herself, like planets caught forever in her gravity. And maybe that's the lesson. Beauty can be a gift, but too much of it attracts not only admiration, but destruction. Of course, you could also just say the ancient Greeks were really traumatic. They never told a story when they could tell a tragedy, never painted love without mixing in loss. But isn't that why you're here, half drowsy in the quiet, listening to these tales? The soft rhythm of sorrow and beauty, woven together like a lullaby, is strangely comforting. It reminds you that even pain can be shaped into something enduring. Let's add a lighter note, because even in the most tragic myths, there's room for a small smile. Imagine Adonis today, not in mythic Cyprus, but in modern times. Would he be an influencer? A runway model?
Would Aphrodite stalk his Instagram, liking every photo while Persephone slid into his DMs during the winter months? You can picture it. A divine love triangle played out in hashtags and story updates. Hashtag blessed, hashtag eternal custody battle. Even gods, perhaps, wouldn't escape the chaos of social media. Still, as you drift through this story, the humor fades, replaced by the weight of its ending. A flower blooming from blood, petals trembling in the breeze, a goddess kneeling over her lost love, her grief immortalized in fragile beauty. A mother turned into a tree, her tears hardened into resin that perfumes temples. Together, they remind you of the strange paradox at the heart of mythology. Sorrow becomes memory, memory becomes story, and story becomes eternal. So now, as the scene fades, you imagine walking through a quiet grove. The air is fragrant with the resin, and here and there, delicate red flowers nod in the breeze. You pause, listening. The leaves rustle softly. The petals shiver as though alive. And you realize you are standing in a place where grief has taken root and blossomed. Myrrha and Adonis remain here, their stories not forgotten, but growing still, carried on the wind, etched into bark and petals. You take a breath, slow and steady. The myths settle into your mind like fading echoes. The night stretches ahead, and with it, more tales, waiting to unfold. You leave behind the grove of resin and blossoms, and the air changes. The scent of pine and cedar fades, replaced by something heavier, an unease that hums just beneath the surface. The Greeks loved to tell stories where the natural order bends, where a moment of arrogance or cruelty transforms a man into something else entirely. And tonight, you step into one of those stories, one that might explain why the howls of wolves still stir something primal in your chest. It begins with a king named Lycaon. He ruled over Arcadia, a rugged land of mountains and forests where shepherds tended their flocks and hunters tracked deer through the shadows. Lycaon was not a humble man. No, he was one of those rulers who thought power placed him above gods themselves, as if Olympus were a court he could mock without consequence. And in Greek mythology, mocking the gods is like daring lightning to strike. You might not know when it will come, but come it will. Zeus, king of the gods, decided to test him. In disguise, as he often did, Zeus came down from Olympus and visited Lycaon's palace. He wanted to see whether this mortal king respected the laws of hospitality, xenia, the sacred duty to welcome guests with food, shelter, and kindness. To the Greeks, hospitality wasn't just good manners. It was divine law. Treating a guest poorly was an insult to the gods themselves. Now, you'd think a king would know this, but Lycaon didn't just fail the test. He failed it spectacularly. Some versions say he tried to trick Zeus by serving him a meal of human flesh, the roasted remains of a hostage, or even, according to darker tellings, one of his own sons. Others say he simply scoffed at Zeus, sneering at the idea of reverence. Either way, it was an act so outrageous, so drenched in hubris, that the air itself must have shivered with anticipation of what would follow. Zeus didn't waste words. No long lecture, no second chances. He flipped the table, metaphorically and perhaps literally, and unleashed his wrath. Lightning scorched the halls of Lycaon's palace. Fire devoured stone. And in the midst of the chaos, the king himself began to change. his skin darkened with coarse hair, his hands curled into claws, his jaws stretched into a muzzle lined with sharp teeth, his voice dissolved into a growl, guttural and inhuman. In a blink, Lycaon was no longer a man, but a wolf, the first werewolf, born from arrogance and divine punishment. You can almost picture it. The great hall of Arcadia, once echoing with laughter and arrogance, now filled with snarls. A crown lies abandoned on the ground, melted and twisted from heat, while a wolf paces among the ruins, eyes still gleaming with the flicker of human rage. The myth says Lycaon fled into the forests, his kingdom shattered, his sons scattered, his name forever cursed. This is one of those myths that sticks because it feels strangely familiar. Across cultures, wolves carry a double meaning, symbols of wild freedom and dangerous predators. The Greeks took that fear and gave it a face. A man cursed to embody the wild hunger that lurks beyond firelight. The word lycanthropy, the idea of turning into a wolf, traces straight back to Lycaon's name. Even today, werewolves in books and movies owe their lineage to a boastful king in Arcadia who thought he could outwit Zeus. And here's the quirky detail that makes this even more interesting. Ancient rituals in Arcadia carried whispers of this myth. At Mount Lycaon, the very mountain said to be sacred to Zeus, there were rumors of secret sacrifices. Some later writers suggested that young men who ate part of a ritual meal might be transformed into wolves for 9 years, only regaining their human form if they avoided eating human flesh during that time. It's a chilling echo of the Lycaon myth, half religious rite, half nightmare legend. Imagine living in a village and watching one of your neighbors vanish into the woods after a strange ceremony, only to wonder if the growl you hear at night is him. Of course, we should be careful. Not every ancient rumor is fact. Sometimes it's just later writers sensationalizing a story they barely understood. But isn't it fascinating how myth bleeds into ritual, how fear and faith mingle until you can't quite tell them apart?
Now let's soften the edges a little, because if you picture Lycaon as a modern werewolf, the image gets almost comedic. Imagine him not as a snarling beast in the forest, but as someone awkwardly navigating daily life with wolf instincts. Grocery shopping would be a disaster. PTA meetings? Forget it. And you can't help but wonder, if Lycaon were alive today, would he be a horror movie icon or just a very hairy guy with a TikTok following? Hashtag first werewolf, hashtag cursed king. But beneath the humor, the myth still bites. It warns that arrogance against the gods is not just reckless, it's fatal. It reminds you that even kings can fall, reduced to beasts by their own hubris. And it explains, in the way myths always try to explain, why wolves carry such weight in our imaginations. They aren't just animals. They are the shadows of men who forgot humility, cursed to wander beneath the moon, forever hungry. So as you sit with this tale, the night air feels heavier again. You hear the distant rustle of leaves, the crack of a twig. Is it just the forest? Or is it something else? Something watching? A pair of eyes gleams in the dark, gold and sharp, unblinking. You shiver, but it's not fear that lingers, it's awe. Because even in the quiet, the myth lives on, pacing the edges of your imagination, waiting for you to notice. The story of Lycaon doesn't end with his own snarling transformation. Like any good myth, it ripples outward, touching not just him, but his family, his land, and even the way future generations understood their world. You've already seen how Zeus's wrath turned him into the first werewolf, but Lycaon wasn't alone in his arrogance. He had sons, many sons, depending on which ancient writer you read. Some say there were 50 of them, others a little fewer,
But either way, it's enough to fill a couple of school buses, and almost all of them shared their father's streak of defiance. These sons weren't just spoiled princes living in luxury, they were active participants in Lycaon's crimes. In the darker versions of the tale, it wasn't just Lycaon who tried to serve Zeus human flesh. It was a collective family project. They took a hostage, killed him, and offered the roasted remains to their guest, never realizing who sat across the table. Imagine the arrogance in that dining hall. Laughter echoing off marble walls, servants carrying in platters of roasted meat, and Zeus, in disguise, sitting calmly at the feast with storm clouds already gathering behind his eyes. When the thunder finally cracked, it wasn't just Lycaon who paid. Zeus unleashed his fury on the entire household. Some say he obliterated them with bolts of lightning, reducing stone to rubble and flesh to ash. Others say the sons scattered like frightened wolves, fleeing into the wilds of Arcadia where their father had gone. And in some traditions, the curse of the wolf extended to them as well, doomed to roam the forests as beasts, reminders of their family's crime. This detail matters because it turns the myth from a personal punishment into something bigger, a family curse, a cautionary tale about how corruption spreads like wildfire. It wasn't just the king who fell, it was his whole line. And isn't that a theme you've seen in plenty of myths and even in modern stories? One person's arrogance dragging everyone around them into ruin. Now, here's where it gets really fascinating. The region of Arcadia, where Lycaon ruled, had its own reputation for being wild, untamed, and just a little eerie. To the rest of Greece, Arcadians were mountain folk, closer to the wilderness than the polished city-states of Athens or Corinth. They had a reputation for being rustic and maybe even a bit savage. It's no coincidence that a myth about the first werewolf sprouted here. If you were an Athenian hearing this tale, you might nod and think, of course it happened in Arcadia. That place is full of strange rites and wild people. In a way, Lycaon became not just a cursed king, but a symbol of his land, forever tied to its dark forests and howling wolves. And here's a quirky tidbit that ties everything together. On Mount Lycaon, yes, the very mountain named after him, there was an altar to Zeus, where, according to whispers and suspicions, human sacrifice might have been practiced in ancient times. Archaeologists have found ash pits filled with animal bones, and while there's no hard proof of human remains, ancient writers like Pausanias hinted at it. They claimed that those who ate from such sacrifices risked turning into wolves themselves, condemned to wander for 9 years before regaining their humanity. It's like the myth of Lycaon seeped into the rituals of his homeland, or maybe those rituals gave birth to the myth. Which came first? No one knows, but the overlap is deliciously eerie. You can almost imagine it. An ancient Arcadian festival, the fire burning high on the mountain, shadows dancing across stone altars. Priests chant to Zeus, while villagers look on, nervous but compelled, glancing at one another as if to say, "Did you hear what happened to Lycaon? Best not to cross the gods tonight." Myth becomes memory. Memory becomes ritual. And soon the lines blur until the whole mountain seems haunted by the possibility of men turning into wolves. Of course, in modern times, the whole thing would probably be explained away as superstition or misunderstood ritual. But for the Greeks, it was very real. And that's the beauty of it. You get to wander through these stories, half believing, half smiling at the absurdity, knowing that somewhere in those forests, people once truly thought they might meet a cursed wolfman. Now, for a lighter moment, imagine Lycaon's 50 sons as a modern reality TV cast. Picture a show called Arcadia's Next Top Alpha, where each brother competes for dominance,
only to be disqualified when Zeus storms the sets with lightning. Or imagine their group chat. Guys, Dad says we're serving Zeus tonight. Thumbs up emoji. You can almost hear the dramatic music as the plan unfolds. Sometimes myths read like the world's oldest cautionary soap opera. But beneath the humor, the myth keeps its teeth. The lesson isn't subtle. Arrogance poisons not just the leader, but the whole household. And the gods won't hesitate to wipe the slate clean. That's why even centuries later, when someone spoke of wolves in Arcadia, they didn't just mean animals. They meant the shadow of Lycaon, the king who became a beast, and his brood who followed him into ruin. As you settle deeper into the story, you realize how it lingers. The firelight flickers, the forest hums, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howls. Maybe it's just an ordinary wolf hungry for deer or rabbits. Or maybe, just maybe, it's the echo of a king and his sons, cursed to roam forever, their arrogance etched into the night air like claw marks on stone.
The wolf isn't just a scary animal skulking through Greek forests. It's a symbol, a metaphor, and sometimes even a teacher. You've already seen how Lycaon's transformation into a wolf marked him as cursed, but if you step back, you'll notice that wolves had a much deeper presence in Greek imagination. They weren't only symbols of punishment, they were tied to gods, rituals, and the blurry line between civilization and the wild. Think about it. In ancient Greece, the wolf represented both danger and survival. These were people who lived close to nature, farmers, shepherds, hunters. Wolves were predators, always ready to raid flocks of sheep, which meant constant tension between humans and nature. For a shepherd in Arcadia, a wolf wasn't just a myth. It was a real, growling threat in the night. But at the same time, wolves had qualities admired in warriors: strength, cunning, loyalty to their pack. To the Greeks, the wolf was a paradox, part nightmare, part role model. Take Apollo, for example. He's usually pictured as the golden god of light, music, and reason, but one of his older titles was Apollo Lycaeus, Apollo of the wolves. In some traditions, he wasn't just a sun god, he was also a protector and guide of wolves. His connection might even trace back to early rituals where wolves symbolized purification or initiation. That means Apollo, shining beacon of rationality, also carried the shadow of the wolf. It's almost as if the Greeks were admitting that even their most orderly gods had a wild streak lurking beneath the surface.
And then there's Zeus himself. Remember Mount Lycaon, where Lycaon's legend takes place? The name comes from Lycos, the Greek word for wolf. Some scholars argue that Zeus's identity there was closely tied to wolf symbolism, maybe even as a wolf god. Imagine Zeus not as the regal thunder wielder sitting on his throne, but as a shape-shifting figure with fur bristling and eyes glowing in the firelight. It adds a layer of menace, doesn't it? Suddenly, Lycaon's punishment feels even more poetic. If you mock the wolf god, maybe you become one yourself. Now, let's slip in a quirky tidbit. Greek words related to wolves pop up everywhere in their culture. The word lycanthropy, which you probably know as the term for werewolf transformations, literally means wolfman. The Greeks use it to describe not just myths, but also mental illness. A person who thought they were turning into a wolf might be diagnosed with lycanthropy. Picture some poor soul wandering the streets of Athens, howling at the moon, while philosophers in white robes nod seriously and say, "Ah yes, classic case of wolf thoughts." It's equal parts eerie and oddly modern. This blending of myth, medicine, and language shows how deeply the wolf had dug its claws into Greek culture. For them, wolves weren't a quirky Halloween costume. They were a lens for understanding the wild side of humanity. The civilized Greek city was all about order, walls, laws, reason. The wolf stood outside those walls, snarling, reminding them that chaos and hunger were never far away. And in myths like Lycaon's, the line between the two gets crossed. You step outside the laws of gods and men, and suddenly you're a wolf, cast into the wilderness.
You can feel how that imagery would stick, can't you? It's bedtime, you're lying by the fire, and an elder whispers the story about the king who became a wolf. The wind howls outside the hut, sheep stir nervously in the pen, and for a moment you believe that if you break the sacred rules, you too might find fur creeping across your skin. Sleep tight, little shepherd. Don't serve Zeus anything funny at dinner. Of course, wolves weren't only about punishment. They also cropped up in more positive myths. Take Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis. Some versions say she transformed into a wolf while fleeing the wrath of Hera. That makes the wolf not a curse, but a guardian form, a way of surviving divine harassment. Artemis herself, goddess of the hunt, was often linked with wild animals, wolves included. In her stories, the wolf wasn't just a predator, it was part of the natural balance she defended. And here's a modern aside for you. Ever notice how every culture has some version of the wolfman? From Native American skinwalkers to Norse berserkers, the idea that humans can slip into a wolf's skin is universal. Why? Because wolves represent the untamed life we've pushed aside. They hunt at night. They howl together under the stars, and they live with the freedom that both terrifies and fascinates us. The Greeks just happened to write one of the earliest drafts of that story, with Lycaon as their opening act. Now, to keep things light for your sleepy brain, let's imagine Lycaon's PR team. After the whole turned into a wolf scandal, they release a statement. Our client, King Lycaon, is simply exploring a rustic lifestyle in Arcadia. He is reconnecting with nature. Yes, he may be chasing deer through the woods, but that's just part of his wellness retreat. You almost feel bad for the guy, until you remember the human flesh incident. Yeah, no sympathy there. But the symbolism remains powerful. The wolf wasn't just an animal, it was a mirror. For the Greeks, it reflected the best and worst in humans. Strength, loyalty, savagery, hunger. And when a king like Lycaon crossed the gods, the punishment wasn't random. It was perfectly tailored. He became the very beast that symbolized what he had unleashed: lawlessness, appetite, chaos. So the next time you hear a wolf howl in a movie or see one on a t-shirt, remember, you're looking at a symbol older than Rome, older than written myth. The Greeks stared at those glowing eyes in the forest and saw themselves, stripped of law and reason. They told their children, don't be like Lycaon, or the gods might let the wolf inside you out. And as you drift deeper into this story tonight, you can almost hear the echo of that ancient howl. Not a threat, not even a warning, just a reminder. Civilization and wilderness live side by side, and sometimes the border between them is thinner than a shadow. Once a myth is born, it rarely stays put. Lycaon's wolf story, like a restless creature itself, slinked beyond the mountains of Arcadia and padded into Roman imagination, then into the medieval mind. You might think of myths as stone statues, unchanging, frozen in time, but really, they're more like gossip at a family dinner. Each retelling adds a twist, trims a detail, or spices it up with a dramatic flourish. And Lycaon's fate as the first werewolf, Oh, it became the perfect story to wander across centuries. The Romans, for starters, had no problem adopting Greek tales. In fact, they made a hobby out of it. They absorbed Greek gods, renamed them, and slotted them neatly into their own pantheon like trading cards. When it came to wolves, they already had a deep connection. Rome's founding myth is drenched in wolf symbolism. Think of Romulus and Remus, the twin brothers suckled by a she-wolf. In their version, the wolf isn't punishment, it's nurturing, survival, the animal that gave Rome its future. But introduce Lycaon into the mix, and suddenly Rome had two competing wolf symbols, one that gave life and one that cursed it. This tension only made the myth more fascinating. Some Roman authors nodded to Lycaon's transformation as a kind of cautionary tale. Cross the gods and you end up less than human. Others used it to play with the duality of wolves, protectors on one hand, monsters on the other.
As centuries passed, the story didn't fade, it evolved. By the time we reached the Middle Ages, the myth had taken on a much darker tone. The Christianized world rebranded wolves not just as chaotic predators, but as tools of the devil. That meant Lycaon's fate was no longer just a story of divine punishment, it was evidence of satanic meddling. A man becoming a wolf wasn't just poetic justice, it was a warning about sin, sorcery, and the dangers of dabbling in forbidden knowledge. Here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval Europe, werewolf trials were an actual thing. Just like the infamous witch trials, people could be accused of transforming into wolves. Imagine standing in a gloomy courtroom with nervous peasants whispering about how you looked a bit hairy last full moon, and suddenly you're sentenced for lycanthropy. In France, a man named Gilles Garnier was executed in the 16th century for allegedly turning into a wolf and attacking children. Of course, historians now chalk this up to hysteria mixed with gruesome crime, but the roots of the accusation stretch all the way back to Lycaon's myth. And if you want another twist of irony, the word lycanthropy itself stuck around from Greek into medieval Latin, then into English. So when people in the Middle Ages whispered about werewolves, they were really recycling Greek vocabulary. That's Lycaon's linguistic ghost, still prowling through the centuries. Now, picture yourself in a medieval village. The night is pitch black. No streetlights, no glow from city skylines, just the cold stars and the restless forest. Wolves howl in the distance, and every creak of wood sounds like claws scraping at your door. A traveling storyteller sits by the fire, recounting tales of a king who mocked the gods and was turned into a wolf. The villagers nod, glancing nervously at the shadows outside. The story isn't just entertainment anymore, it's explanation. Why do wolves circle the village? Why do some men act with beastly cruelty? Because once upon a time, the boundary between man and beast was broken. The myth's journey didn't stop there. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering classical texts, picked up Lycaon's story again. They weren't afraid of wolves in the same way as their medieval ancestors, but they loved digging into the moral lessons of antiquity. To them, Lycaon's transformation wasn't just spooky, it was philosophical. What does it mean to lose your humanity? Is a man without morality any different from an animal? These questions kept Lycaon's tale alive, polished and reframed for a new era. And here's where we land in modern times. Today, when you think of werewolves, you're probably not picturing a Greek king punished by Zeus. You're thinking of full moons, silver bullets, maybe even a teenage drama with too much hair gel. But all of that, the howling at the moon, the fear of transformation, the duality of man and beast, has a line tracing straight back to Lycaon. He's the original werewolf, whether Hollywood knows it or not. To keep things light, imagine Lycaon trying to sue Hollywood for royalties. Excuse me, I invented the werewolf concept, and I'd like my cut of the Twilight profits. Sadly for him,
Immortality came not through wealth, but through bedtime stories, whispered fears, and centuries of imagination. And so, as you drift tonight, you're lying in the same tradition as an ancient shepherd in Arcadia, a Roman poet, a medieval peasant, and a Renaissance scholar. All of them stared into the darkness, thought about wolves, and felt that prickling question, where does the human end and the beast begin? Lycaon may be long gone, but his howl still echoes in every tale of transformation, every nightmare of fur and fangs. A myth rarely punishes just one person. In Greek storytelling, when a god loses patience, the fallout often spreads like a stain through an entire family line. Lycaon, poor wolf king of Arcadia, didn't just drag himself into infamy, he pulled his children into the mess too. And by children, I don't mean a handful. According to some sources, Lycaon had 50 sons. Yes, 50. Apparently, he treated fatherhood like a marathon. And in a way, that number feels symbolic. The abundance of corruption, multiplied across a dynasty. Now, the ancient sources disagree about exactly how Zeus punished all of them, but the theme is consistent. When the father is rotten, the fruit doesn't come out much better. Some versions say the sons joined in Lycaon's blasphemous meal, helping prepare or even consuming the human flesh he offered Zeus. That meant divine punishment had to extend to the entire brood. Others say a few sons might have been spared, but most accounts treat them as co-conspirators. Here's a mainstream fact. Pausanias, the Greek traveler and geographer of the 2nd century AD, mentions that Lycaon and many of his sons were struck down by Zeus's thunderbolt, reducing their palace to ashes. Imagine the lightning bolt, a white-hot crack splitting the sky, obliterating not just the man, but an entire house, a dynasty, a legacy. It wasn't just retribution, it was cosmic spring cleaning. But myths don't stick to one clear version. Other tellings lean into the werewolf angle more heavily, suggesting that some of Lycaon's sons were also cursed to become wolves. That creates an eerie image, not just one king prowling the Arcadian hills, but a whole pack of wolfmen, doomed to stalk the forest together, snarling at the moon. Family dinners would have been awkward, to say the least. Hey, Dad, pass the venison. Sorry, son, I ate it raw.
And then there's the really quirky tidbit. One son in particular, Nyctimus, plays a strange role in the myth. In some stories, Nyctimus is the youngest son, spared by Zeus while his brothers are obliterated. Why? Well, depending on who you read, it was either because Zeus wanted to leave a shred of mercy, or because Gaia, the earth goddess herself, begged for his life to be spared. That single act of survival allowed the royal line of Arcadia to continue. So even within a myth about total annihilation, there's this flicker of continuity. The gods, after all, didn't want to wipe Arcadia off the map. Just teach it a lesson. This family angle mattered to the Greeks because myths weren't just random horror stories. They were often tied to local dynasties, temples, and even political claims. Arcadian nobles could point to Nyctimus' survival and say, see, we descend from him. We survived divine wrath. That makes us special. Myths weren't only entertainment. They were branding. Ancestry.com with more lightning bolts and fewer subscription fees. And think about the psychology of it. If you were a shepherd in Arcadia, raising goats near Mount Lycaon, you might look up at the ruins of some old palace stones and whisper to your children, that's where the Wolf King lived. That's where Zeus struck him down. It explains the ruins, the fear of wolves, even the reputation of the local elite. Myth becomes a kind of shadow history, filling the gaps that actual chronicles leave silent. Of course, the idea of a cursed family line is something the Greeks adored. The house of Atreus, with Agamemnon and all his doomed descendants,
a train wreck of betrayal, cannibalism, and revenge. Oedipus and his line? More curses, more horror. Lycaon fits snugly into this pattern. The sins of the father don't just ruin him, they echo for generations. You can almost imagine an Arcadian teenager centuries later rolling his eyes when someone mentions Lycaon. Yeah, great-granddad was turned into a wolf. Can we move on already? Now here's where things get a little spookier. Some local traditions claimed that descendants of Lycaon's line had to perform rituals at the sanctuary of Zeus Lycaon. And in some tellings, those rituals involved, let's say, unusual sacrifices. Rumors swirled that cannibalistic practices survived long after the original myth, whispered about but never proven. Archaeologists have debated whether human bones found at Mount Lycaon indicate ritual sacrifice or just the blending of myth and rumor. But for the villagers, the story stuck. The family of the Wolf King had strange shadows hanging over them. And so Lycaon's myth never really ended with his transformation. It rippled out through his sons, his land, and his supposed descendants. The curse was less about fur and fangs, more about reputation, how a single scandal could mark a whole lineage. You could say Lycaon's real punishment wasn't becoming a wolf. It was condemning his bloodline to carry the stink of his crime forever. As you lie here now, drifting further into that dreamy state, imagine the sound of a wolf pack somewhere in the hills, howling together. One howl alone is eerie. 50 howls together are overwhelming. That's Lycaon's family curse, echoing through time. Not one wolf, but many, their voices twining in the night air. If there's one thing the Greeks loved, it was attaching their myths to geography. Lycaon wasn't just some random king in some random story. They pinned his legend directly to a real place, Mount Lycaon, a towering, mist-wreathed peak in Arcadia. To this day, if you hike up its slopes, you'll find crumbling stones of an ancient sanctuary dedicated to Zeus. The locals believed this was where the god himself descended to punish Lycaon, the very spot where the thunderbolt struck. That sacred ground became a magnet for rituals, stories, and whispered fears. Now, here's a mainstream fact. Ancient writers like Pausanias recorded that Mount Lycaon was home to a sanctuary of Zeus Lycaos, Zeus of the wolves. It wasn't just a shrine. It was a place where people claimed to see strange shadows, where even the air seemed unsettling. Pausanias himself said that no one was allowed to enter the central altar area without risking death. It was forbidden, secretive, and shrouded in mystery. For a people who loved to mix religion with awe, this was the perfect stage for a myth like Lycaon's. Think about it. You're a shepherd trudging up the mountain with your flock. The wind is cold, the pines creak overhead, and somewhere off in the distance you hear wolves crying. You glance at the ground and swear you see claw marks scratched into ancient stones. Suddenly you remember the old tale. A king who mocked Zeus, a family turned to wolves, a curse that lingers in the soil. Your skin prickles and you hurry your sheep along. That's how myths stay alive, not because people sit down with books, but because the landscape itself seems to retell them every night. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some traditions claimed that Mount Lycaon wasn't just a place of worship. It was also home to unusual athletic games, older than even the Olympics. Called the Lycaea, these games were part festival, part ritual, and part mystery. Unlike the Olympics, which celebrated the human form with sports and races, the Lycaea had darker rumors attached. Whispers of human sacrifice, cannibalistic rites, and initiations where boys supposedly became wolves for a time. Were those rumors true? Hard to say. Archaeologists debated fiercely. Some bones unearthed on the mountain hint at human remains, while others argue it's all legend. But the idea stuck, and that's what mattered. Picture it. Thousands of years ago, a crowd gathers on the mountain slopes. There are races, feasts, traders selling honey cakes, and maybe, just maybe, rituals hidden from public eyes. A boy disappears into the woods, symbolically transformed, and returns years later as a man, reborn. That sounds suspiciously like a wolf initiation, doesn't it? If you squint, you can see how this fed the myth of Lycaon's curse, blurring the line between fact and legend. The Greeks had a word for this kind of blending, mythos. It wasn't about literal truth, but the meaning behind the story. Whether or not human sacrifices actually happened, the very rumor gave Mount Lycaon its eerie gravity. People feared it, respected it, and believed that the land itself remembered Zeus's judgment. Now, let's take a modern aside, because honestly, this feels a bit like the ancient version of haunted house tourism. You know how today people will swear a certain hotel is cursed because of a ghost sighting 200 years ago? Same vibe. Ancient Arcadians turned their mountain into a living reminder of divine justice. Visit Mount Lycaon, where a king became a wolf. Don't get too close, though, or the curse might notice you. If travelable shores existed back then, Arcadia would have had some wild ones. There's also an interesting psychological layer here. Wolves in Greek culture weren't universally evil. They represented danger, yes, but also wilderness, independence, and untamed strength. By tying Lycaon to wolves, the myth wasn't just about punishment. It was about what happens when humans reject order and embrace raw animal instinct. The mountain became a symbol of that tension, half sacred, half wild, teetering between civilization and chaos. And imagine lying in your bed now, as the night stretches on, picturing that mountaintop. Thin air, a high altar wrapped in clouds, the sound of wolves echoing in the distance. If you let yourself sink deeper into the vision, it's almost like you're standing there, shivering in the cold, wondering if the stones beneath your feet still remember Zeus's lightning strike. It's the kind of image that feels both grand and intimate, like you've brushed against a story too old to be fully grasped, but too vivid to ever forget. Even the name Lycaon itself is revealing, is tied to the Greek word lykos, meaning wolf. The myth and the mountain weren't just coincidental companions, they were linguistically linked. The very syllables of his name echo the animal he became, so whenever someone spoke his story, the wolf was right there, waiting in the sound. That kind of wordplay wasn't accidental. It was how myths embedded themselves into memory. Say the name, and you've already hinted at the curse. And here's one last detail. Ancient Arcadians sometimes claim that when thunderstorms rolled across Mount Lycaon, it was Zeus himself returning to the scene of the crime, revisiting the place where he smote Lycaon. Imagine how that felt, lying in your hut at night, thunder booming in the distance, and thinking, well, guess Zeus is mad at the Wolf King again. Suddenly, your storm isn't just weather. It's living proof of a story passed down for generations. So yes, Lycaon's tale isn't just about him. It's about the land itself, the games, the rituals, the language, even the storms. Myths rarely exist in isolation. They're stitched into geography, into tradition, into the Larry soil. And in this case, every pine needle on Mount Lycaon seemed to whisper, "Beware the Wolf King." If you've ever wondered why wolves carry such a mythical aura across cultures, Lycaon's story is a perfect doorway into that question. Wolves are not just animals prowling in the night. They are symbols, archetypes, and metaphors wrapped in fur. The Greeks weren't alone in this. From Norse sagas to Native American tales, wolves appear again and again as creatures that straddle the line between danger and wisdom, between chaos and guidance. In Lycaon's case, the wolf became a shorthand for what happens when humanity forgets its boundaries and slips back into the wilderness. Let's ground this in a mainstream fact. Wolves in Greek culture weren't universally demonized. In fact, Apollo himself had an epithet, Apollo Lykaios, or Apollo of the Wolves. Far from being terrifying, this title connected him with protection, leadership, and the solar light that kept darkness at bay. That means even within the same pantheon, wolves could represent divine order or primal destruction, depending on the story. Lycaon embodied the darker side. His transformation into a wolf wasn't empowerment, it was exile from civilization. He crossed the line from ruler to beast, and Zeus made sure everyone remembered it. Now for the quirky tidbit. In some versions of Akkadian folklore, people believe that wolfmen weren't just a one-time curse. They thought lycanthropy could be passed down like a family recipe. If a man ate human flesh during certain secret rituals, he'd turn into a wolf for 9 years. Survive that time without eating more humans, and you might be allowed to return as a man. But slip up and taste flesh again, and the wolf form would be permanent. It's like the world's worst loyalty program. 9 years of good behavior and we'll give you your humanity back. Honestly, even in myth, that sounds like a terrible deal.
But what fascinates me most is how this Greek myth foreshadows the global fascination with werewolves. Picture the medieval villagers in Europe, centuries later, whispering about cursed men roaming under the full moon. Or the Hollywood monster movies where werewolves tear across silver screens. The DNA of those stories lies right here, in Arcadia, where a king mocked Zeus and paid for it with a fur coat and a new diet. Lycaon wasn't just a myth. He was patient zero for an entire genre of supernatural storytelling. Let's bring this down to your own experience. Imagine yourself standing in a dark forest. You hear the crunch of leaves under your boots, the moon glimmers through the branches, and then you hear a howl. It's distant at first, then closer, and you're suddenly hyper-aware of every shadow moving around you. Rationally, you know it's probably just a wolf or a coyote, but some small primal part of you whispers, what if it isn't? What if it's something older, something cursed? That's the grip Lycaon's myth still has on our imaginations. It turns an animal into a mirror of our deepest fears and questions. Of course, leave it to the Greeks to mix philosophy into even their horror stories. To them, Lycaon's curse wasn't just punishment, it was an allegory. What separates man from beast? Is it law, morality, restraint? Or is civilization just a fragile layer we peel away too easily? The story answers by showing what happens when a king, of all people, abandons those restraints. He becomes a wolf, proof that without justice and piety, humans are indistinguishable from animals. It's basically the world's earliest TED Talk on why we need rules, except with the more lightning bolts.
Another fascinating thread is how the Greeks wove astronomy into their myths. Some scholars argue that Lycaon's wolf transformation was tied to constellations. The ancient sky watchers loved embedding stories in the stars. When they looked up at the constellation Lupus, the wolf, they may have remembered Lycaon's fate. Imagine lying back on a hill, looking at the night sky, and seeing not just pinpricks of light, but entire legends playing out above you. That's the beauty of myth. It makes even the heavens feel like a storybook. Here's a modern aside. Think about how often wolves pop up in pop culture today. Game of Thrones gave us dire wolves as noble companions. Twilight turned werewolves into moody teenagers. Even sports teams love borrowing wolf imagery for strength and ferocity. Every time you see a wolf logo or hear a movie howl in the background, you're basically catching an echo of Lycaon. The Greeks might not recognize the NBA, but they'd probably nod at the symbolism. Ah, yes, wolves, still terrifying, still cool. And while you're lying here, maybe half drowsy now, picture Lycaon's fate as more than punishment. Think of it as a bedtime parable. He mocked the gods, broke sacred trust, and in doing so revealed the beast within himself. His story lingers because it's not just about one man. It's about all of us, the constant balance between our higher selves and our instincts. Some nights, when the moon is high and the air is still, maybe you even feel that balance tip for a moment. The wild calls to you, softly but insistently. So Lycaon's wolf isn't just a monster, it's a symbol. A reminder that civilization is precious, fragile, and always one bad decision away from crumbling. And as you imagine his shadow moving along the ridges of Mount Lycaon, you can almost hear the wind whisper, "Remember the king who became the first wolf." Now, as Lycaon prowls the edge of memory, you find yourself shifting from the shiver of his punishment to the rituals that wrapped around his name long after. Because here's the thing, myths don't stay locked in dusty scrolls. They bleed into festivals, sacrifices, and whispered traditions that whole communities share. In Arcadia, high up on Mount Lycaon, the people carried out ceremonies in his name for centuries. And they weren't simple picnics with olives and bread. These were dark, enigmatic rites that mingled fear with devotion. And they kept the legend of the wolf alive long after Lycaon himself had vanished into fur and shadow. Here's the mainstream fact. Ancient Greek sources tell us that human sacrifice might have been part of the rituals on Mount Lycaon. Writers like Pausanias and Plato drop hints about grim offerings to Zeus Lycaos, the wolf Zeus, performed in the same place where Lycaon supposedly served his gruesome banquet. Even in the culture already comfortable with animal sacrifice, this rumor stood out. Human offerings were considered rare, almost taboo in mainstream Greek religion. The fact that Arcadia had such stories gave it an aura of strangeness, of being just a little bit wilder than the rest of Greece. But here's the quirky tidbit. In some versions of the legend, anyone who tasted the flesh of these sacrifices was doomed to become a wolf for 9 years. Think of it as a supernatural probation period. If the unlucky eater avoided human meat for nearly a decade, he could shed his fur and return to humanity. If not, the curse became permanent. Honestly, the idea sounds like the world's weirdest diet challenge. Stick to vegetables and lamb for 9 years, or else you're stuck howling forever. Makes keto look tame, doesn't it? You can almost picture the rituals themselves. A circle of priests chanting under the high Arcadian sky, smoke rising from the altar, and a nervous crowd murmuring as they wait. Lightning often struck the mountain, and people believed it was Zeus himself approving or disapproving of the rites. Imagine being there, with the smell of burnt offerings clinging to your clothes, wondering if someone at that altar was about to test the 9-year wolf curse. It's no wonder Arcadia carried the reputation of being Greece's supernatural heartland, a place where boundaries blurred and shadows always seemed thicker. And it wasn't just myth or gossip. Archaeologists digging at Mount Lycaon have uncovered ash altars filled with burned animal bones and even some human remains. Charred fragments that hint these tales might not have been pure imagination. Standing at that altar, people might have believed they were in direct conversation with Zeus, that every offering was part of a cosmic bargain. A storm rolls in, thunder cracks, and suddenly the idea of wolves lurking just beyond the firelight doesn't feel like a bedtime story. it feels like a warning. Now, let's drift into your own imagination for a moment. Picture yourself climbing Mount Lycaon on a cool night. The path is rocky, the air thin, and the stars blaze overhead. You reach a clearing where the altar once stood, and for a moment you hear echoes, not of people, but of howls carried by the wind. It's just the mountain playing tricks, of course, but in the quiet of night, you wonder, did those sacrifices really happen? Did men truly walk away with fur on their backs and yellow eyes shining? The ambiguity makes it scarier than certainty ever could. The story also rippled into philosophy. Plato, in his Republic, mentions the Lycaon rites while talking about what happens to men who let appetite overrule reason. The wolf curse became a metaphor for corruption. Eat human flesh, indulge your basest instincts, and you'll transform into something less than human. Think of it as Plato's polite way of saying, don't be gross or you'll lose your humanity. Even the high-minded philosophers couldn't resist weaving moral lessons into these creepy myths. And here's a modern aside for you. Every time you hear about werewolves in pop culture, whether it's a brooding teen movie, a gothic horror flick, or a Halloween costume, you're brushing against these same Arcadian rituals. The concept of transformation linked to eating human flesh, that's still in the DNA of werewolf lore today. Next time you see someone in furry ears and fake claws, just remember, somewhere in Arcadia, 2,500 years ago, people thought it wasn't a joke. They thought it was real. Now imagine this as a bedtime tale. The villagers whisper about a man who didn't return after the sacrifice. They say he was seen later in the forest, walking on all fours, his eyes glinting like coals in the moonlight. Children huddled closer to their mothers, merchants shut their doors early, and the sound of howling sent shivers down spines. You tuck yourself into a blanket, safe, but you can't help wondering what it would feel like to be that man, pacing the woods with your humanity locked away, waiting for 9 long years to see if you could ever earn it back. And here's one more layer of irony. Centuries later, Roman writers borrowed the Lycaon myth and rituals to explain why wolves seem to have supernatural power across Europe. In Rome, the tale morphed into festivals like the Lupercalia, where men dressed in goat skins ran through the streets, smacking onlookers with strips of hide for good luck and fertility. It wasn't exactly as turning into a wolf, but the echo of Lycaon lingered. A Greek king who tricked Zeus became, in a way, part of the cultural DNA of Roman holidays and eventually modern werewolf legends. In the end, Lycaon's myth wasn't just about one man being punished by Zeus. It became a ritual, a cautionary tale, and a lingering reminder that even kings could become beasts. Arcadia embraced that mystery, weaving it into their mountain ceremonies, ensuring that every howl in the night carried more than fear. It carried history. As the howls of Lycaon fade into the night air, you drift into another tale. This one's softer at first, but no less strange once you let it unfold. Because myths aren't always thunderbolts and blood. Sometimes they sneak in like a whisper, a fragrance carried on the breeze. And in this case, that fragrance is myrrh. You know it, the resin used in ancient perfumes, incense, and even as part of embalming rituals. But behind every familiar substance lies a story, and in the Greek imagination, myrrh wasn't just a product of nature. It was the consequence of a scandal so shocking that even the gods shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Here's the mainstream fact. The story of Myrrha, also known as Smyrna, explains the origin of the myrrh tree. In the myth, Myrrha was a mortal princess who became entangled in a tragic, forbidden love, directed of all people
toward her father, King Cinyras of Cyprus. Now, don't worry, we're not diving into lurid details here, but the Greeks told it as a story of divine punishment and human weakness all rolled into one. The gods, whether out of cruelty or caprice, sometimes twisted the desires of mortals, and poor Myrrha was caught in the storm. When her secret was revealed, she fled in shame and despair, praying for release from her torment. The gods answered, turning her into the myrrh tree, and from her bark tears of resin still wept, crystallizing into the fragrant substance used in temples and tombs. And here's your quirky tidbit. In some versions of the story, the child of this tragedy was none other than Adonis, the impossibly beautiful youth who later became the lover of Aphrodite. Imagine that for a family tree. Yes, my mom turned into a tree and I grew out of the bark. That's one way to explain your backstory at dinner. The Greeks had no shortage of these origin stories that sound almost like someone was trying to improvise mythology on the spot. But that was part of the charm. Nature itself seemed to hold the fingerprints of human drama.
Now, as you settle deeper into the quiet, picture Myrrha wandering through the moonlit hills, carrying her unbearable secret, the scent of cypress trees thick around her. You can almost feel her desperation, the cool night air clinging to her skin as she begs the gods for mercy. And then, slowly, her limbs stiffen, her feet root into the ground, and her arms stretch skyward, bark encasing her as the world blurs. You're not watching a punishment now, you're watching a metamorphosis, a strange mercy disguised as cruelty. And from the cracks of her wooden form, drops of resin begin to fall, tears made permanent, frozen in amber light. If you've ever smelled myrrh in incense, you know it carries a bittersweet aroma, resinous, smoky, almost mournful. The ancients believed that fragrance was Myrrha's sorrow still lingering, a memory of her pain woven into every grain of sap. Imagine lighting a piece of it in an ancient temple. The smoke curls upward, soft and steady, and you're not just offering a sacrifice, you're inhaling the myth itself, letting her story wrap around you in scent. It's strangely comforting, and yet it holds a sadness, as if reminding you that beauty often grows from brokenness. And there's something deeply human about this myth, even if the details are extreme. At its core, it's about shame, regret, and the desire for transformation. Who hasn't, at some point, wished to be changed into something else? Something that could escape the weight of choices or circumstances. Myrrha got that wish, but in the way of myths, it came with a twist. She became a tree, rooted forever, unable to move, yet forever weeping. Her tears became useful to mortals, perfuming their rituals, healing their wounds, but her own story remained trapped in silence.
Now, imagine yourself as a traveler in antiquity, walking into a cypriot grove where myrrh trees stand tall. The bark is rough under your fingertips, and if you cut into it, resin drips slowly, like sap infused with sorrow. The locals tell you in hushed tones, that's Myrrha, the princess who prayed for release. And suddenly the grove feels less like a simple forest and more like a sacred space, haunted not by ghosts, but by memories fossilized into the trees themselves. The myth also echoes far beyond Greece. Myrrh itself played a huge role in ancient cultures. Egyptians used it in embalming mummies, Jewish rituals included it in sacred anointing oil, and Christians remember it as one of the gifts brought to the newborn Jesus. So when you light a stick of incense today, you're part of a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, with roots tangled not only in trade routes, but in a story of sorrow turned to fragrance.
Myrrha's tragedy lives on, not in shrines or songs, but in every wisp of smoke curling into the air. And because this is supposed to ease you towards sleep, let's soften the edges. Think of the Myrrha tree not as a frozen prison, but as a kind of sanctuary. Myrrha's transformation is painful, yes, but also protective. Within the bark, she no longer has to flee, no longer has to hide her face. She becomes something still, enduring, fragrant, the kind of presence you feel rather than see, like the hum of cicadas at night, or the way a candle flickers in a darkened room. So, while Lycaon's myth left you staring into the eyes of a wolf, Myrrha's story carries you into stillness, the hush of a grove, the bittersweet perfume of resin in the air, and the thought that sometimes, even tragedy can seek beauty. You let that scent drift over you like a lullaby, soothing, steady, and strangely timeless. You let the fragrance of Myrrha's sorrow drift away like fading incense, and before you know it, the tale of transformation gives way to another that's equal parts eerie and oddly practical. Because if Myrrha showed you how myths can explain the origin of a tree, the next story proves that myths can also explain how someone might gain the strangest of gifts, understanding the language of animals. And you can almost hear it now, can't you? The rustle of wings, the distant bark of dogs, the hum of bees. What if instead of guessing at their cries, you could actually understand every word? Here's the mainstream fact. The Greeks told the story of Melampus, a mortal man blessed with the ability to comprehend animals. His legend wasn't about grandiose battles or Olympian grudges, but about how empathy, yes, actual empathy, could turn into a superpower. The myth says that Melampus once showed kindness to snakes, creatures most people feared. When their parents died, he carefully buried the serpents and gave them the dignity of rest. Grateful for his compassion, the snakes licked his ears while he slept. And when he woke, Melampus could hear the voices of every creature around him, birds, dogs, even insects, each chattering in its own tongue. Suddenly, the world wasn't silent background noise anymore. It was alive with gossip, complaints, and little secrets, all audible to one man. And here's your quirky tidbit. Ancient sources like Apollodorus mention that Melampus actually used this gift to score some very practical wins in life. For instance, when termites started gnawing at the beams of a house, Melampus overheard their chatter about moving into a new spot. He warned the owners just in time, saving their home. Imagine that. Your pest control guy shows up, puts his ear to the wall, and says, "Yep, they're planning to relocate by Tuesday." Now that's customer service.
Picture yourself with this gift for a moment. You're walking through a meadow at dusk, the grass brushing against your legs. A sparrow swoops low and scolds you for stepping too close to her nest. A fox pauses on the edge of the trees, muttering about how humans always ruin the good hunting grounds. A pair of crickets chirp at each other like old friends, trading complaints about the weather. Normally, this would just sound like background noise. But to Melampus, and to you if you imagine hard enough, it's a bustling city of voices, each tiny life announcing itself. Now, unlike many mythological figures, Melampus wasn't just a quirky side character. His ability actually propelled him into legendary status. According to the myths, he became a renowned seer and healer, sought after by kings. At one point, he even cured a group of women struck with madness. These women, possessed by Dionysus for refusing his worship, roamed the countryside in a frenzy. Melampus, using both his knowledge of herbs and his gift of understanding animals, eventually restored their sanity. And in return, he was given part of a kingdom. So yes, empathy with snakes and gossiping termites eventually landed him political power. Talk about career development. The story of Melampus is unusual because it's less about divine punishment or shocking tragedy and more about reward. He was no tragic tree, no snarling wolf man. He was a mortal who proved that compassion toward even the lowliest creature could open doors to mysteries others couldn't see. And maybe that's why his myth feels oddly cozy compared to some of the others. It's not about being cursed, it's about being gifted, about the world revealing its secrets when you choose kindness over fear. Let's ease deeper into that thought. Imagine lying on soft grass under the night sky, stars glittering above. Around you, the chorus of the natural world hums on. Frogs croak, owls call, a hedgehog rustles through fallen leaves. To most, it's just ambience, but to Melampus, and to you, if you let yourself sink into the myth, it's conversation. The owl asks the frog about the changing winds. The hedgehog grumbles about the cold. The stars overhead may be silent, but everything beneath them is alive with chatter. You can almost hear it if you slow your breathing, soften your focus, and let the background noise become language. And here's the quiet brilliance. Myths like this remind you that the Greeks didn't see nature as silent or dead. They saw it as buzzing, living, speaking. If only you had the ears to listen. That perspective is strangely comforting when you're drifting towards sleep. The thought that you're never really alone because the world itself hums with countless voices, waiting just beyond the edges of perception. Of course, in real life, you're probably relieved you don't understand the full conversations of mice scurrying in the attic or pigeons bickering on a windowsill. Imagine trying to sleep while hearing a crow argue politics with a seagull. But that's part of the charm. Greek mythology exaggerated reality to teach lessons, entertain, and occasionally poke fun at human anxieties. And Melampus stands out because his power wasn't flashy, it was subtle, intimate, rooted in attentiveness. So as you drift now, let the world around you feel just a little more alive. The hum of the fan in your room becomes the whisper of a small spirit keeping watch. The distant sound of traffic outside turns into a caravan of ants, marching endlessly with purpose. And your own heartbeat slows, syncing with the rhythm of the night, as if you too are part of a conversation older than any human tongue. That's the gift of Melampus. Not just hearing animals, but recognizing that the world has never been silent. You just needed to lean in close enough to listen.
You've walked with Melampus through a meadow alive with whispers, and now you find yourself following those murmurs back toward the shadowy corners of myth, where things grow stranger, darker, and a little more uncanny. Because while some myths reward kindness with miraculous gifts, others remind you that curiosity, especially when it pokes too close to the divine, can bring consequences you didn't quite bargain for. And somewhere in the overlapping space between gods and mortals, between obedience and rebellion, lies a story about secrets, punishments, and a reminder that even in myth, timing is everything. The mainstream fact here, the Greeks often tied myths to natural phenomena or to cultural lessons. While Melampus taught you that empathy could grant power, other stories served as cautionary tales about hubris, about the dangers of overstepping boundaries with the gods. And in these tales, it's rarely the act itself that causes ruin, but the audacity to trespass into knowledge reserved for the divine. The Olympians, after all, were notoriously protective of their privileges. Cross them, and you'd find yourself transformed, struck down, or exiled. Take the story of Tiresias, for instance. You've probably heard his name in connection with Oedipus, the tragic king who couldn't quite handle prophecy. But Tiresias had his own myth long before that infamous role. His origin, depending on which version you prefer, is a strange tale about stumbling into divine secrets. In one version, Tiresias encountered snakes mating and struck them apart. Instantly, he was transformed into a woman. Years later, when he saw the same snakes again and left them be, he was turned back into a man. Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside, and finding your entire existence altered because of serpentine romance. Not exactly a great start to the day.
But here's the quirky tidbit. Because Tiresias had lived as both a man and a woman, he gained a perspective on love and relationships that no other mortal could claim. And when Zeus and Hera argued about who enjoyed love more, men or women, they summoned Tiresias for a verdict. He sided with Zeus, which, as you might guess, did not thrill Hera. She struck him blind on the spot. To soften the blow, Zeus gave him the gift of prophecy. So the man who once swung a stick at some snakes ended up being the most famous seer in Greek mythology. Lesson learned: never underestimate what a bad mood from Hera can do to your life plan. This story, in its sleepy rhythm, feels like it belongs alongside Melampus, another myth of transformation linked with animals, another tale where unexpected empathy or violence shifts your place in the world. But instead of granting the pleasant gift of understanding crickets and foxes, Tiresias was burdened with the heavy responsibility of foresight. Knowing the future, after all, rarely makes life easier. Usually it just means you get to worry longer. Now imagine you're Tiresias, sitting quietly at dusk. You hear the rustle of the leaves, the faint hiss of snakes coiling in the underbrush, and you know that one wrong movement could change everything. You close your eyes, and when you open them again, the world has altered. Your body, your fate, your entire trajectory. The myths don't give you a choice in the matter. They just sweep you along, much like dreams do. The Greeks seem to delight in weaving these cautionary tales with almost dreamlike logic. If Myrrha's transformation explained the origin of a fragrant resin, and Lycaon's curse explained the wildness of wolves, then Tiresias's tale explained why seers often lived lives tinged with tragedy. Because the gift of knowledge, whether it comes from animals or from prophecy, is never free. And this is where you notice something subtle but profound. Myths didn't always paint the gods as noble protectors. Often, they were petty, jealous, or quick to anger. A mortal like Tiresias, who accidentally brushed against their secrets, became a pawn in their quarrels. That's the sleepy revelation of this myth. Not every punishment has to feel earned. Sometimes it's arbitrary, born from divine whims, and that makes the world of mythology eerily similar to real life. Let's ground this in a more modern image for a moment. Imagine overhearing two managers arguing in the office kitchen. They turn to you and demand you pick a side. You give your honest opinion, and instantly, one of them cancels your vacation days. That's essentially what happened to Tiresias, except instead of canceled vacation, he lost his eyesight forever. Makes your boss's pettiness look almost forgiving, doesn't it? And yet, despite this cruel twist, Tiresias becomes indispensable. Kings, queens, even gods seek his wisdom. He appears in countless stories, always the reluctant bearer of hard truths. And through it all, you sense that he never really asked for this role. He was just a man who disturbed some snakes. That's the haunting charm of Greek mythology. You don't get to choose the myth you fall into. Sometimes it chooses you. As you drift with this thought, the myth becomes less about snakes or arguments between gods and more about inevitability, about how lives can pivot on a single moment, a single gesture, a single careless strike of a staff. And isn't that what falling asleep feels like sometimes? One moment you're awake,
listening to the hum of your room, and the next you've crossed into a dream you didn't plan to enter. You don't pick the dream, it just arrives, sweeping you along. So let the myth of Tiresias settle gently in your mind. A story of transformation, blindness, and reluctant wisdom. Another tale in the great endless sea of myths, where animals whisper, gods bicker, and mortals stumble into destinies they never sought.
You've listened to Tiresias stumble into destiny, but your path doesn't linger with him. Instead, you drift deeper into that quiet twilight space of myths where gods test mortals and mortals, in their clumsy persistence, manage to rewrite the rules of existence. Here, in this dim corridor of memory, another story unfolds. One not about prophecy or serpents, but about language itself, and how a single shift in speech could change everything. The mainstream fact here: Greek mythology isn't just about gods throwing lightning bolts or heroes slaying monsters. It's also about explaining the quirks of human culture, how names, customs, and traditions came to be. These myths worked like narrative glue, stitching together why certain rituals existed or why certain words carried power. And sometimes the myth behind a ritual was more memorable than the ritual itself. That brings you to the tale of Echo and Narcissus. On the surface, you probably know it as the story of a vain young man who fell in love with his own reflection. But the real heart of the story begins with Echo, a nymph whose only crime was loving to talk a little too much. Imagine her as that friend who can't resist finishing your sentences or adding a running commentary to every thought. That was Echo. She was delightful, but in Hera's eyes, she was an annoyance, because Echo's chatter often distracted Hera just long enough for Zeus to sneak away with his questionable extracurricular activities. The quirky tidbit: Hera punished Echo in a way that feels almost modern in its cruelty. She took away her ability to speak freely, leaving her only able to repeat the last words spoken to her. Essentially, Hera turned Echo into the world's first glitching voice assistant, forever stuck parroting fragments of someone else's thought. It's a punishment that sounds humorous at first, but becomes eerie the more you think about it. Imagine losing not just your voice, but your agency, reduced to nothing but a reflection of others. Now picture the lonely stillness of a forest at dusk, when the cicadas are quiet and the trees lean close. You call out, and from the darkness comes your own voice bouncing back. That chilling repetition, the sound of you not quite being you, is Echo's myth woven into the very bones of the natural world. She's still there, in every canyon and cave, reminding you that some punishments linger far longer than intended. Of course, mythology being mythology, Echo crosses paths with Narcissus, a man so dazzling he made entire villages stop mid-conversation. Narcissus was the sort of figure who could walk into a room and instantly make everyone else feel like they'd forgotten how to dress properly. Echo fell for him immediately, but with only fragments of borrowed words, how could she ever confess her love? She tried, poor thing, repeating his phrases back, building a conversation from scraps. Narcissus, irritated and amused, rejected her outright, and her heartbreak, like her voice, faded into fragments, until all that remained was the Echo you hear today. Here's where the myth bends back on itself, because Narcissus wasn't exactly spared either. He wandered to a still pond, saw his reflection, and fell in love with it. Obsessed, unable to look away, he wasted away at the water's edge. The gods turned him into a flower, the narcissus, which still bows its head near streams as if gazing forever at its reflection. 2 punishments, 2 lives altered, all because one god found a mortal's tatter inconvenient. You can let the story drift like mist in your mind.
a myth about voice, reflection, and the strange relationship between identity and recognition. Echo, condemned to repeat, reminds you of how fragile individuality can be when someone else controls your words. Narcissus, lost in his own beauty, shows the danger of obsession with self. Together, they leave behind a pair of haunting metaphors, your voice bouncing back from stone and your reflection shimmering in water. And yet, in this drowsy space, the myth doesn't feel like a warning so much as a lullaby. You picture yourself standing at the edge of a pond, watching the ripples blur your reflection into something unfamiliar. You whisper a word, and the trees give it back, softer, slower, carrying it farther into the night. The story becomes less about punishment and more about rhythm, the rhythm of sound returning, the rhythm of water quivering, the rhythm of myths looping endlessly through time. Think of how children sometimes test echoes for fun, yelling nonsense into a canyon just to hear it doubled back. That innocent joy hides something profound. The echo is always yours, but also not yours. It belongs to you and doesn't. It's your voice, but hollowed, shifted, untethered. It's a reminder that the world has ways of holding on to pieces of you long after you've gone. So, in this myth, Echo is not just a tragic figure, but also a guide, teaching you to listen for what lingers. Narcissus is not just vain, but fragile, teaching you how dangerous it can be to drown in your own reflection. Together, their story is a sleepy reminder that sound and sight, voice and image are never entirely trustworthy. They're always shifting, fading, being reinterpreted, much like dreams themselves. As you drift, you hear her voice one last time, not mocking, not tragic, just soft, like the repetition of a lullaby. A word spoken back to you, not because it has to be, but because repetition in its own way can be comforting, like a story told again and again until it lulls you to sleep. The forest falls quieter still, and you step deeper into the twilight of myth, where every shadow hides a forgotten name. Tonight, another of those forgotten names surfaces from the undergrowth. A mortal whose tale is equal parts strange, unsettling, and oddly comical if you squint at it from the right angle. His name is Myrrha, or rather hers, because this is the tragic story of a young woman entangled in fate so twisted that even the gods looked away in discomfort. Mainstream fact first. Myrrha, sometimes called Smyrna, is remembered most as the mother of Adonis, the impossibly beautiful youth who later became beloved by Aphrodite. That detail alone has kept her myth alive because Adonis went on to play a starring role in Greek tales of love, loss, and seasonal rebirth. But Myrrha's own part of the story is darker, stranger, and often skipped over in favor of her son's glamorous destiny. Now, the quirky tidbit. In certain versions of the myth, Myrrha was cursed by the gods to fall in love with her own father. Yes, you heard that right. Ancient myths didn't always tiptoe politely through human taboos. They barreled through them, sometimes as cautionary tales, sometimes as metaphors, and sometimes, honestly, just because storytellers like to shock their listeners. Myrrha's curse was one of those cases where a divine grudge led to an outcome so twisted it makes modern audiences squirm. But you're not here to squirm. You're here to sink into the rhythm of the story. So picture it like this. Myrrha, cursed and desperate, wandered the palace halls at night, her footsteps muffled against the cold stone. Her father, oblivious to the gods' meddling, welcomed her without suspicion. But the gods, being what they were, delighted in pushing mortals to their breaking point. It's as if Olympus sometimes ran on a policy of maximum drama, minimum compassion. When the truth inevitably surfaced, Myrrha's life shattered. Terrified and ashamed, she fled into the wilderness. You can almost see her, bare feet pounding the earth, branches clawing at her arms, her breath quick and ragged as she begged for release from the curse that had twisted her soul. And here's where the story shifts from horror into transformation, because the gods finally showed mercy. They turned her into a tree, the myrrh tree, whose fragrant sap was said to be her tears. Pause for a moment and imagine that. A tree, its bark streaked with golden resin that smells both sweet and bitter. That resin, in ancient times, became one of the most prized substances on earth. Myrrha was burned in temples, used in perfumes, medicines, and even embalming rituals. In a strange way, Myrrha's suffering gave the world something sacred, something enduring. Out of unbearable shame and divine cruelty came a gift that people associated with healing, prayer, and memory. There's a soft irony in that, isn't there? Her body was taken, her life rewritten, but her sorrow became incense rising toward the heavens. It's the kind of irony Greek mythology excelled at, turning human misery into some poetic explanation for why the world smells the way it does when resin burns. And here's your quirky detail for the night. Some versions say that even while in tree form, Myrrha gave birth to Adonis. Imagine that image, a newborn child cradled by roots, the first cries breaking the silence of a forest glade. It's surreal, unsettling, but also strangely magical. Adonis, the child of this strange origin, would grow into a figure so beautiful that even Aphrodite, the goddess of love herself, could not resist him. But as you'll see later, beauty in myth is rarely a blessing. It's more like a cosmic bullseye painted on your back. Still, for Myrrha, the transformation into a tree was both an end and a continuation. She escaped the unbearable weight of her curse, but in doing so, she rooted herself forever in sorrow. Her tears hardened into something tangible, something sweet and bitter, just like her story. Picture the scene as if you're standing before that tree now. The night air hums with quiet insects, the resin glistens in moonlight, and the faint scent of incense wafts toward you. You reach out, brushing your fingers along the bark, and feel the ridges pulsing faintly, like veins. It's a reminder that myths often blur the line between the human and the natural, folding people into rivers, birds, constellations, and trees. Myrrha's myth is not just about tragedy, it's about transformation, how even in suffering, the world finds a way to create beauty. And maybe there's a lesson tucked in there, softer than the drama of the tale itself, that sometimes the parts of us shaped by pain still become gifts to others, that what feels like sorrow in one moment might turn into a fragrance remembered for centuries. Myrrha's myth lingers not because of its taboos, but because of its aftermath, the way grief hardened into something sacred, the way despair blossomed into Adonis, whose beauty would shake the hearts of gods. So, you step back from the tree, letting the fragrance of resin cling faintly to your skin, and carry with you the echo of Myrrha's sorrow, now softened by time, into a bittersweet lullaby. The forest path continues, winding beneath silver-washed branches, and the shadows seem to deepen into shapes of half-forgotten creatures. After the stillness of Myrrha's sorrow, the story shifts again, drawing you toward a figure who straddles the line between man and myth, a trickster of sorts, a listener to whispers that most mortals could never hear. His name was Malimpas, and unlike the tragic Myrrha or the cursed Lycaon, his gift wasn't destruction but understanding. He was the man who could speak to animals. Mainstream fact to anchor the tale. Malimpas was a legendary seer in Greek mythology, remembered for his prophetic abilities and for introducing the worship of Dionysus into Greece. His family line wove through the myths of kings and heroes, and he often appeared as the wise figure who saved kingdoms through foresight. But what set him apart most of all was his unique bond with animals, a connection so strong that their voices became his wisdom. The quirky tidbit: according to one version of his origin, snakes slithered over Malimpas while he slept as a boy and licked his ears clean, giving him the power to understand the speech of birds, dogs, cattle, practically anything that moved. It's a bizarre mental image, a child snoozing peacefully while snakes do some kind of mythical earwax removal treatment. You probably wouldn't want that to happen at your next spa day, but in mythology, it worked out pretty well. With this strange gift, Malimpas became a bridge between humans and animals. Imagine him standing on a hillside, pausing to listen to the chatter of sparrows, then turning to warn a village of an approaching army. Or walking into a pasture, tilting his head at the lowing of oxen and emerging with advice about the weather. It makes him sound almost like a Disney character centuries before Disney existed, except with more oracles and fewer cheerful songs. One of Melampus's most famous stories tells of him curing the madness of the women of Argos. These women, cursed by Dionysus for neglecting his rights, roamed the hills in a frenzy. Their screams echoed across the land, their eyes wild, their hands tearing at their own hair. The king of Argos, desperate, called for Melampus, and here's where his unusual talents made the difference. He knew how to listen, not just to humans, but to the natural world around them. Through rituals, herbs, and the whispers of animals, he found a way to soothe the women and restore peace. There's something oddly modern in that story, isn't there? The idea that healing comes not just from force or control, but from listening, from harmony with the world around you. Melampus was, in a sense, an early therapist, except his therapy involved sacred rituals and farmyard consultations instead of couches and clipboards. Another tale has him overhearing termites gnawing away at the beams of a palace, while others heard nothing but silence. Melampus paused, cocked his head, and frowned. "That beam won't last the night," he warned. Sure enough, before dawn, the palace roof collapsed. You can almost imagine his smug little smile in that moment, the told you so of a man whose ears never missed a thing. And yet, Melampus wasn't always the all-knowing sage. One story shows his gift leading him into trouble. While imprisoned, he heard worms in the beams above his cell, predicting that the roof would soon collapse. He quickly shouted the warning, saving himself and his fellow prisoners. Instead of being grateful, his captors began to suspect he had divine powers, and powers made people nervous. His survival earned him freedom, but it also marked him as someone apart, someone touched by the uncanny. To balance the tension, there are lighter tales too. Birds supposedly warned him of oncoming disasters. Ants carried grain to form messages he could read, like tiny divine telegrams scurrying over the ground. Even dogs, with their simple barks and howls, spoke to him of things their masters never noticed. Imagine your own pet dog glaring at you for missing dinner. But in Melampus's case, the message would be crystal clear. "Hey buddy, refill my bowl. Also, don't trust the neighbor." But beyond the humor, Melampus's legend taps into a deeper truth. Survival often comes from paying attention to the quietest voices. His gift wasn't strength, wealth, or divine parentage. It was awareness. He lived in tune with the rhythms of nature, attuned to the overlooked. That gave him a type of power that swords and armies couldn't match. Now picture him not in a palace court, but right here, on the path beside you. The forest is hushed, but he tilts his head, catching the rustle of a beetle, the trill of an owl, the scurry of a mouse. To you, it's background noise. To him, it's a chorus of warnings and secrets. The owls say rain is coming, he might murmur, or the ants warn of rot in the foundation. It's the sort of superpower that seems humble at first glance, but could change the fate of kingdoms. There's a slow warmth in his tales, something different from the heaviness of Myrrha or the terror of Lycaon. With Melampus, you get the sense of being guided to slow down, to listen, to notice what normally slips past. The Greeks often valued strength and conquest, but in Melampus's story, it's the quiet observer who holds the power. Imagine the fireside in some ancient village, shadows flickering as this story was told. Children lean close, wide-eyed at the thought of animals speaking. Elders nodded knowingly at the wisdom of listening more than speaking. The myth itself becomes like a lullaby, reminding listeners that the world is always murmuring, if only they have the patience to hear it. And perhaps, in a way, that's why his story lingers in your mind as you drift deeper into the night. Not because of battle or tragedy, but because of that gentle reminder. The world is alive with whispers, and sometimes the softest voice carries the greatest truth.
The path stretches further now, softer beneath your steps, as though you're moving into a gentler corner of the dream. The ground seems padded, as if moss has crept in to cradle each footfall. The air is lighter too, carrying the faint resinous scent of pine mixed with something sweet, almost like honey warmed in the sun. You're in a quieter place now, where the mists themselves feel less hurried, less thunderous, more like ripples instead of crashing waves. After the odd companionship of Melampus, you drift deeper into the landscape of the obscure, where myths grow quieter, less polished, and sometimes half forgotten. Tonight, one of those forgotten voices belongs to a figure who never commanded the sky or stirred the seas. He is no Zeus, no Poseidon, not even a trickster Hermes. And yet, for a moment, he shines with surprising intensity, tucked into the margins of the mythic record like a handwritten note on parchment. This is the story of Aristeus. You might be asking, why him? Why someone so small in the vast cosmos of myth? But that's the point. Greek mythology was not a neatly bound book, not one canonized Bible of the gods. It was a collection of shifting stories, sung by poets, reshaped by playwrights, whispered by villagers, and scattered across centuries. Each region had its own gods and its own favorite tales. The Olympians, those familiar names plastered across Hollywood movies, were only the tip of a far deeper, stranger iceberg. Mainstream fact, many Greeks would never have seen a temple to Zeus in their lifetime. They would, however, know the god of their local spring, the spirit of their olive grove, or the nymph of the mountain where they herded goats. For them, these smaller, quieter figures were the divine made close and tangible. Enter Aristeus, a rustic god whose portfolio was simple yet profoundly important: bees, cheese, and olives. Forget lightning bolts, forget thrones of marble. This was the god who taught humans how to keep bees, how to press olives into oil, and how to churn milk into cheese.
Aristeas was the god of survival skills. He was divine agriculture in a tunic. More practical than flashy, more helpful than terrifying. And here comes the quirky tidbit. One story tells us that Aristeas lost his bees, all of them. One day, the hives stood empty, the buzzing gone. Modern readers might raise an eyebrow, thinking of today's colony collapse disorder. But the ancients had their own explanation. Desperate, Aristeas went to Proteus, the shape-shifting sea god. Proteus told him to sacrifice cattle to make amends, and when the carcasses rotted, bees swarmed out of the decaying flesh. Yes, you heard that right. Bees from bovine corpses. It's grotesque, a little stomach-turning, but it reflects an ancient belief in bougonia, the spontaneous generation of bees from dead animals. Picture a Greek villager shrugging as they told this story. Of course, bees come from cows. Where else would they come from? It sounds absurd to us, but to them, it was part of a natural order woven with myth. And in that, you glimpse how myth filled the gaps where science had yet to tread. But Aristeas' myth doesn't end with honey. He also blunders into tragedy. One day, he saw Eurydice, the beautiful wife of Orpheus, wandering in a meadow. He pursued her, whether with intent to woo or worse, depends on which version you read. In her panicked flight, Eurydice stepped on a snake and was bitten. She died in the grass, her life extinguished in an instant. That single event set Orpheus on his famous descent to the underworld, his heartbreaking attempt to bring her back, and his ultimate failure.
So yes, Aristeas is remembered in two ways: as the god who gave bees and cheese, and as the man who triggered one of the greatest love tragedies of all time. He didn't mean to be remembered like this, of course, but myths rarely care for fairness. Sometimes you are the hero, sometimes the scapegoat, sometimes both. And maybe that's why this story feels so sleepy in its pacing. It doesn't pound with battles or roar with thunder. Instead, it hums quietly, like a hive, buzzing with the soft lesson of unintended consequences. You don't need a throne of Olympus to matter. Sometimes your role is to show how small choices ripple into epic stories. Imagine sitting in an ancient village at dusk. The hearth fire glows, shadows stretch across clay walls, and someone begins to murmur this tale. The goats bleat faintly in their pen, the bees hum outside the window, and the olive trees sway in the night breeze. Nobody gasps or claps at the ending. They simply nod, recognizing the warning. Be careful where you run. Be careful what you chase. This is mythology at its most intimate. Not grand, not cosmic, just human, with a hint of divine. And as you listen, you realize that not every story needs thunder to echo. Sometimes it can be as small as a honeybee and just as sweet, lingering in memory long after the fire dies down. The forest around you seems to take on that same hum, a faint vibration in the air, like bees hidden among the branches, drifting lazily in twilight. Their presence isn't threatening, but hypnotic, like white noise folding over your thoughts. And as you follow the path deeper, you realize how comforting these smaller myths can be. They don't shake the heavens, but they steady the soul, easing you toward the drowsy edges of dream. The forest path continues, winding like a lazy serpent, the air growing thicker with the perfume of wild herbs, thyme, sage, and something faintly metallic, like the tang of old bronze left too long in the rain.
The trees press closer now, their trunks dark and twisted, almost resembling watchful figures lining the trail. You feel as though you've stumbled into the wings of some forgotten play, where shadows carry the weight of stories too strange to ever make the main stage. And tonight, one of those stories brushes against you like a half-whispered warning, the tale of Myrrha. If Aristeus's myths buzzed like bees and hummed with survival, Myrrha's story slithers, uncomfortable, sharp-edged, and undeniably tragic. It is the kind of myth that makes you pause, even as your eyelids grow heavy, because it reveals the darker corners of the Greek imagination. Mainstream fact first, Myrrha, also known as Smyrna, was said to be the mother of Adonis, the impossibly beautiful youth who would later be beloved by Aphrodite. Adonis's myth is famous, but the story of how he came to be is much less celebrated. That's because it involves a scandalous taboo union that even ancient poets struggle to tell. According to one version, Myrrha was cursed by the gods. Sometimes it was Aphrodite herself, sometimes the Furies, and in still others, the anger of the gods for neglecting their worship. The curse compelled her to fall in love with her own father, King Cinyras of Cyprus. It's disturbing, unsettling, and the Greeks themselves treated it like a cautionary tale whispered rather than proclaimed. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some versions of the myth claim that Myrrha tricked her father into sleeping with her by disguising herself in darkness over several nights, until one day the truth was revealed. Imagine that moment. Torches flaring, the king realizing the horror of what had unfolded, and Myrrha fleeing into the wilderness, ashamed, terrified, and cursed beyond redemption. You can almost picture the ancient storytellers pausing at this part of the tale, lowering their voices. They lived in a society where family, honor, and devotion to the gods were everything. Myrrha's story wasn't designed for entertainment. It was mythology as boundary marker, a giant red line scrawled across the imagination. Here lies danger. Here lies ruin. As she fled, Myrrha begged the gods to have mercy, and in the cruel yet poetic way of myth, they answered, not by forgiving her, but by changing her. They transformed her into a tree, the myrrh tree, whose resin drips like tears. From this resin came the precious perfume of myrrh, used in rituals, embalming, and offerings to the divine, a substance both sacred and sorrowful, born from her body, her punishment, and her grief. And out of that tree, her child was born. Adonis did not come into the world through ordinary birth, but emerged from the bark itself. You can imagine the image, a crack splitting across rough bark, light spilling through, and a figure forming from the wood. The myth paints Adonis almost like a flower bud forcing itself free, fragile and miraculous, an impossible beauty born of despair. Think about the irony here. Adonis, the youth whose beauty would ignite one of mythology's most famous love triangles between Aphrodite and Persephone, began as the child of tragedy. Out of a cursed desire came someone destined to embody the fragility and fleeting nature of beauty and life itself. The Greeks loved this kind of paradox, light born out of shadow, beauty rooted in pain, life twined with death. It's easy to get lost in the tragedy of Myrrha, but pause for a moment to imagine sitting beneath the tree she became, the bark smooth under your fingers, the resin droplets catching firelight like amber jewels, each drop glowing faintly as it slides downward, perfuming the air with something earthy and bittersweet. It's the scent of mourning and prayer, the same resin burned in temples, offered to gods, and placed in tombs. Myrrha's tears quite literally became sacred.
Now, here's a lesser-known angle. The resin of the myrrh tree wasn't just ritualistic. Ancient medicine prized it as a healing substance, used for pain relief, for purification, even for warding off infections. Imagine that. From a cursed woman's sorrow came a balm that soothed wounds, a fragrance that sanctified prayer, and an oil that preserved the dead for eternity. Her grief, transformed, became something enduring and profoundly useful. And isn't there a quiet comfort in that? Myths often revel in punishment, but this one offers a strange grace that suffering, even at its deepest, can be reshaped into something meaningful. Myrrha's shame was frozen into bark, her tears hardened into amber, her sorrow preserved as medicine and prayer. Picture this now. You're walking deeper into the forest, and the path is lined with trees weeping slow, shimmering resin. Each one holds the echo of Myrrha's sorrow, but also her endurance. The air is rich with their fragrance, sweet, pungent, soothing in a way that makes your breath slow down. You feel lighter somehow, as though even heavy stories, when distilled, can soothe you into calm. Adonis' story will carry forward from here. His beauty, his tragic end, his place in the endless cycle of death and rebirth tied to the seasons. But for now, let the image of Myrrha's tree remain with you. A woman cursed, yes. A tale disturbing, yes. But also a reminder that grief, once endured, can transform into something holy, something timeless, something that lingers long after the suffering has passed. It's a quiet story in many ways, less thunderbolt and divine battle, more whisper and resin tear. Yet maybe that makes it the most human of them all. And as the forest around you darkens into deeper shadow, you realize that sometimes the gentlest myths are also the ones that echo longest in the stillness. The trail narrows, hedged in by brambles that seem to reach for your sleeves, snagging like insistent fingers. The air is heavier here, a little damp, carrying the scent of earth turned after a storm. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hoots, its low voice echoing like a warning. You can sense the forest shifting, preparing you for a story that feels less like a whispered tragedy and more like a growl in the dark. Tonight's tale brings you face to face with Lycaon, the first werewolf, at least as far as the Greeks were concerned. His story is ancient, primal, and it tugs at instincts far older than the marble temples or golden myths. It's about hunger, taboo, punishment, and transformation so shocking that it still claws at modern imagination. The mainstream fact is simple. Lycaon was a king of Arcadia, a ruler who dared test Zeus himself. Arcadia, if you picture it, was a rugged region of Greece. Mountains, forests, wild streams, the kind of place where survival meant being clever, resourceful, and maybe a little wild yourself. Lycaon embodied that wildness, but he also embodied hubris, the fatal arrogance of mortals who thought they could outwit the gods. And how did he test Zeus? Well, here comes the unsettling part. According to the myth, Zeus came to Arcadia disguised as a traveler, seeking hospitality. This was a common test in Greek lore. The gods often wandered in disguise, checking whether mortals would honor the sacred law of xenia, hospitality. To mistreat a guest wasn't just rude, it was a cosmic insult. Lycaon decided to mock this custom. Instead of offering Zeus the finest meat and bread, he tried something grotesque. He killed a boy,
Some versions say it was his own son, and served the flesh as part of a meal to see if Zeus would notice. It's one of those details that makes you wince even as your eyes grow heavy, because it's deliberately shocking. The Greeks didn't shy away from using horror as a moral exclamation point. Now for your quirky tidbit. The name Lycaon itself is tied to wolves. Lykos in Greek means wolf. His very identity was steeped in lupine imagery long before the punishment arrived. It's as if the myth was waiting for the transformation all along, sharpening its teeth in the background. Naturally, Zeus noticed. You don't slip human flesh past the king of the gods. The thunder roared, the disguise dropped, and the anger of Olympus fell heavy on Arcadia. Zeus struck down Lycaon's sons with lightning, sparing none of their arrogance. And for Lycaon himself, the punishment fit the crime. He was transformed into a wolf, his human cunning twisted into animal hunger, his arrogance melted into the instincts of the hunted and the hunter. It's eerie to imagine. One moment, a man, flesh and thawed. The next, fur bristling, teeth snapping, mind half lost in the wildness of the woods. If you close your eyes now, you can almost hear the panting breath, the shuffle of paws on leaf litter, the mournful howl rising through the night air. This story has long been linked with the idea of werewolves, the transformation of man into beast under the curse of divine wrath. The Greeks weren't alone in this fascination. Later folklore from Europe would spin countless variations: silver bullets, full moons, endless hunger. But the seed of it, the primal fear of becoming something less than human, something untamed and ravenous, sits right here in Lycaon's myth. And here's a detail that often gets overlooked. The Greeks associated wolves not just with savagery, but with a kind of liminal wisdom. Wolves roam the borderlands, neither fully tamed nor fully alien. To become a wolf was to step outside society, outside the laws of men, to live on the edge of survival. Lycaon's punishment wasn't just about making him suffer. It was about casting him out of human community altogether, exiling him into the perpetual twilight between beast and man. Imagine yourself walking now, the branches overhead weaving a net of shadows, when suddenly you hear a crack in the underbrush. Your mind flickers, animal or something else. That same flicker lived in the Greeks too. They knew wolves. They heard them in the hills, saw them circle villages, knew that eyes glowed in the dark just beyond the firelight. To tell a story of a king turned into one was to fuse myth with the nightly reality of survival. And maybe that's why the tale still resonates. You felt hunger before, haven't you? The kind that gnaws at the edges of patience, the kind that makes you snappish, less civilized. Imagine that hunger taking over entirely. No rules, no table manners, just teeth and need. That's the fear hidden in the myth, that beneath the polished marble of civilization, we're never too far from fur and fang. Yet, there's also something strangely freeing about it, isn't there? To shed the weight of politics, debts, social roles, to run on four legs guided by instinct alone. Maybe that's why werewolf stories have endured. They terrify, but they also whisper temptation. What if you could escape the rules, the taxes, the endless grind, and just run? The Greeks didn't romanticize Lycaon, though. His fate was cautionary, not liberating. To test the gods was to gamble with the very order of the cosmos, and Lycaon's story is a scar carved into myth as a reminder. Zeus wasn't just a thunder thrower. He was protector of sacred customs, and the violation of hospitality was treated as worse than simple cruelty. It was a cosmic betrayal. Picture the scene now. Zeus rising from the feast, eyes burning, the room flashing with lightning. Lycaon's sons crumbling into ash, the table overturning, the smell of scorched meat heavy in the air. And then the silence of the woods where a wolf's howl breaks through, bitter and lonely. That's the echo of the myth. Civilization overturned, arrogance punished, a man lost to the shadows of his own cruelty. You glance around the darkened forest path, the rustle of leaves sounding a little closer than before. Maybe it's only the wind. Or maybe, just maybe, somewhere out there, Lycaon still runs, forever caught between man and beast, a shadow on the edge of the firelight, reminding you that even kings can fall, and when they do, the forest always remembers. You step deeper into the forest, the shadows folding tighter, the air carrying that faint animal tang that makes you check over your shoulder, even though you know you're alone. The story of Lycaon hasn't quite let go of you yet. It clings, like the memory of a strange howl heard just at the edge of sleep. But as the path curves, the tale stretches further, branching into the ways his punishment echoed across time, folklore, and even ritual. Because myths like this never just stay put. They ripple outward, shaping how generations imagine the wild, the beast, and the fine line that separates man from monster. So here's your mainstream fact. Lycaon's myth isn't just a one-off horror story. It actually underpins the very idea of the werewolf in Western tradition. Later Greek and Roman writers described rites in Arcadia, particularly in a place called Mount Lycaon, where men supposedly underwent transformations into wolves. Pausanias, a Greek traveler and geographer in the 2nd century AD, records that during a ritual sacrifice to Zeus Lycaios, one man would eat a piece of human flesh hidden among the offerings. If he did, he would transform into a wolf for 9 years. If he refrained from eating human flesh during that time, he could turn back into a man at the end. That's an unsettling image, an initiation into wolfhood, not just a punishment. And it connects neatly to Lycaon's own crime, serving human flesh to Zeus. In other words, the myth gave rise to ritual, and ritual reinforced the myth, like a loop tightening around the imagination. Now for the quirky tidbit. The Olympics might be connected indirectly to this very place. Mount Lycaon was considered sacred to Zeus, and it hosted the Lycaon Games, an ancient festival that some believe predated the famous Olympic Games. Picture it. Young athletes competing in a sunlit Arcadian meadow, while just over the ridge, villagers whispered about wolves and men, about transformations that blurred the edges of human identity. The Greeks really did love their juxtapositions. Civilization on one side, primal terror on the other. As you walk the trail, think of how easily ancient people might have believed these transformations. Wolves weren't rare. They prowled the hills, stole sheep, occasionally stalked the unwary traveler. When a man disappeared into the wild for too long and came back changed, hollow-eyed, ragged, perhaps violent, it wasn't hard to imagine he'd been something else for a while. The myth filled the gaps of mystery with fur and teeth. And here's where things get stranger. Some scholars suggest that Lycaon's story reflects real anxieties about cannibalism in ancient society. The horror of eating human flesh wasn't just moral, it was a violation of natural order. By weaving it into the story, the Greeks warned that certain taboos could unmake your very humanity. Break them, and you weren't just cursed, you were stripped of being human entirely. It's unsettling, but also oddly logical. You are what you eat, they said, and if you cross that line, you lose the right to call yourself human. You can almost hear the moral wrapped in thunder. Respect hospitality, respect the order of the world, and never toy with the boundary between man and beast. Zeus's punishment wasn't random. It was poetry, turning Lycaon into exactly what he'd invoked. Now, let's tilt our head sideways for a moment. Imagine yourself back then, huddled near a fire in the mountains, hearing wolves howl. They weren't just background noise. They were a reminder of the thinness of the veil. To be cast out of society into wolfhood wasn't just a punishment, it was a symbol of isolation, of exile. Think about it. Humans are social creatures. A wolf might live in a pack, but for a man turned wolf, the pack is gone. You're an outsider forever. Even today, the myth clings. You hear the word werewolf, and somewhere in the back of your head, you're thinking of a lonely figure under the moon, torn between worlds. Hollywood may have polished it up with silver bullets and full moons, but at its core, it's still Lycaon's punishment echoing through centuries. And here's a playful thought for your sleepy brain. Imagine being one of those Arcadian villagers, sitting around after the Lycaon festival. You nudge your friend and whisper, "Hey, didn't Demetrius disappear for a while? Looks a bit scruffy. Bet he's one of them wolves." Suddenly, the poor guy has to live with side-eye glances and muttered prayers every time he shows up at the market. Gossip and myth walk hand in hand, don't they? But maybe there's something more universal going on here. Every culture has its shapeshifters, its tales of humans becoming animals. In Norse mythology, there are berserkers, warriors who wore wolf and bear skins and claimed to channel their spirits in battle. In some Native American traditions, skinwalkers transform into animals. Even in medieval Europe, courts held trials for supposed werewolves. It's like humanity can't resist the idea that under certain circumstances, the line blurs and the animal inside us slips free. As you wander deeper down the trail, the trees seem to lean in, their shadows thick like pelts. You imagine Lycaon's shape somewhere between the trunks, eyes glinting, half human, half wolf. Not quite gone, not quite home. His punishment isn't just his. It's a reminder that the beast isn't far from any of us. And maybe that's why the myth endures. It's not just a spooky bedtime story. It's a mirror. A reminder that civility is fragile, that hunger, cruelty, or arrogance can unravel it. And in that unraveling, you might just find yourself on all fours, howling at the moon, your name forgotten, your humanity lost. The forest grows quiet again, only the crunch of your steps keeping rhythm. The howls fade, but their echo lingers. And with every rustle in the underbrush, you can't help but wonder if Lycaon's curse still prowls somewhere in the dark, waiting for anyone foolish enough to test the gods again. You follow the winding path, the echoes of Lycaon's curse still hanging in the air like the aftertaste of something bitter. But as the trail bends, the forest begins to thin, and suddenly you step into a clearing where sunlight pours down in lazy, golden sheets. The mood shifts, softening, as if the woods themselves are saying, "Enough of wolves and punishment. Now it's time to see what grew from sorrow." And so, the story turns back to Myrrha. Not as the tragic woman who suffered so cruelly, but as the root of something unexpected, something tender, something that speaks of life cycling endlessly through the seasons. Because from her suffering, a child was born, Adonis. Mainstream fact first. Adonis became one of the most beloved figures in Greek mythology, a youth so beautiful that both Aphrodite and Persephone quarreled over him. He symbolized rebirth, vegetation, and the cycles of nature, themes that go back far earlier than Greece, echoing Mesopotamian fertility gods like Tammuz or Dumuzi. His very existence tied directly to Myrrha's tragic fate. Her body became a tree, and from that tree her son emerged, destined to capture the heart of the goddess of love herself. Out of taboo and despair, the Greeks spun a myth of desire, renewal, and seasonal change. And here's your quirky tidbit. The Greeks actually planted Adonis gardens during festivals. These weren't lush, permanent gardens, but shallow trays filled with quick-growing plants like lettuce, fennel, or barley. The seeds sprouted fast, withered just as quickly, and the whole thing symbolized Adonis's fleeting beauty and tragic fate. Imagine ancient Athenians setting up little clay pots on their rooftops, watching them sprout overnight, only to collapse under the summer sun. It was devotion, but it was also a kind of bittersweet joke. Beauty, like youth, bursts forth suddenly and dies before you can hold on to it. You picture this in your mind as you drift further into the clearing. A tree with smooth bark splitting open, revealing a small child cradled inside. A baby born not from joy, but from punishment, yet carrying in him the seeds of renewal. There's something oddly tender here. The same gods who punished Myrrha allowed her story to continue in a way that gave meaning, even hope. Myth insists that even the darkest soil can produce new life. Adonis grew into a figure of astonishing beauty, so much so that Aphrodite herself, usually portrayed as untouchable, invincible in love, found herself vulnerable. She entrusted the infant Adonis to Persephone, queen of the underworld, for safekeeping. But when Persephone laid eyes on him, she too refused to let him go. Cue divine custody battle, Aphrodite versus Persephone, a tug of war over the most beautiful mortal to ever exist. Zeus, tired of the endless squabbling, finally settled the matter. Adonis would spend 1/3 of the year with Aphrodite in the living world, 1/3 with Persephone in the underworld, and the final third wherever he chose. Naturally, Adonis spent much of his time with Aphrodite, but the cycle was set. And just like that, a myth about forbidden desire transformed into one that explained the rhythm of the seasons. Adonis's time above ground brought fertility, growth, and bloom. His time below meant decay, winter, dormancy. Myrrha's punishment gave way to an eternal cycle. Out of pain came rhythm, pattern, and the very heartbeat of nature. Pause here and let the image sink in. Flowers bursting in spring as Adonis returns to Aphrodite, fields turning golden under his presence, then withering when Persephone pulls him back into shadow. Suddenly, the turning of the seasons isn't just about temperature. It's about longing, jealousy, love, and return. Here's another quirky detail. Later Roman writers tied Adonis to their own festivals. In Rome, the cults of Venus, their version of Aphrodite, sometimes included mourning rituals for Adonis, complete with songs of lamentation. Women would wail in public processions, reenacting Aphrodite's grief at his death, while carrying the fast-sprouting gardens of Adonis. Picture it, entire streets filled with women sobbing dramatically over pots of dying lettuce. Half tragedy, half horticultural comedy. But of course, myths can't resist doubling back to tragedy. Adonis's beauty, as dazzling as it was, also led him to a violent death. While hunting, he was gored by a wild boar. Some say it was just bad luck. Others claim it was divine jealousy. Ares, the god of war and lover of Aphrodite, may have sent the boar out of spite. Aphrodite, stricken with grief, pleaded for his return, and Zeus compromised by letting Adonis split his time between the underworld and the world of the living. And so, once again, myth explained why plants bloom and die each year. Think about this. Death wasn't the end for Adonis. Instead, it was a pause, a cycle. He went down, he came back. Just as seeds fall to the ground, disappear, and then reappear as shoots in spring. Myth made sense of loss by promising return. And maybe that's why these stories endure. They aren't just explanations of nature, they're comforts. Winter isn't simply cold and lifeless, It's Persephone clutching Adonis close. Spring isn't just a thaw, it's Aphrodite rejoicing at his return. It makes the seasons personal, alive, and oddly intimate. Instead of charts of rainfall, the ancients had love stories. Instead of meteorology, they had myth. And you know what? In a way, that's a lot easier to remember. Try explaining the water cycle to a half-asleep farmer. Now try telling him, "Don't worry, Aphrodite is bringing Adonis back soon." Which do you think sticks better?
As you wander further into the clearing, the sunlight warms her shoulders, and you imagine Adonis himself running through fields of tall grass. His laughter rings like birdsong. He carries none of his mother's shame, none of her despair, only beauty and vitality. To the Greeks, he embodied the fleeting, bittersweet truth of life. Everything lovely ends, and perhaps that's why it feels precious. But let's zoom out for a moment. Did you know that Adonis wasn't even originally Greek? His myth likely came from the Near East, tied to Semitic traditions around Tammuz, a vegetation god who died each year and was mourned by women. The Greeks borrowed, reshaped, and gave it a new spin with Aphrodite and Persephone. That's myth for you, a giant cultural game of telephone, each civilization whispering into the next one's ear, changing the details but keeping the rhythm alive. And here's another curious parallel. In Christian Europe, centuries later, some theologians noticed similarities between Adonis and Christ. Both died and returned, both connected to cycles of renewal, both mourned and celebrated. Of course, the contexts were wildly different, but the human desire to see hope beyond death, to believe in return after loss, that runs like a current through myth after myth. As twilight begins to slide into the clearing, you notice how the story loops back on itself. Myrrha, cursed and punished, transformed into a tree. From her came Adonis. From Adonis came the eternal cycle of seasons. From the seasons came humanity's sense of time itself. Out of suffering came the heartbeat of nature, the assurance that winter will end, that bloom will follow decay. The air cools slightly, a breeze whispering through the grass. You realize that myths, in their strange way, don't just explain the world, they soften it. They take pain, injustice, or randomness and fold it into a pattern that feels meaningful. Myrrha's tragedy didn't just vanish, it gave birth to renewal. Adonis's fleeting life wasn't just wasted, it became the rhythm of time. And so, as you leave the clearing, you feel lighter. The shadows ahead don't seem so threatening now. They carry with them the promise that even darkness contains seeds of return. Somewhere, even in the underworld, Adonis waits, ready to rise again when the season calls. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson these myths keep whispering. Every ending holds a beginning. Every loss a return. Every winter a spring.
The path ahead seems to darken again, though not with menace, more like a slow twilight settling across the horizon. You carry with you the lingering image of Adonis, a figure both radiant and fragile, whose life unfolded like the brief bloom of a flower. But myths rarely allow you to stay in the comfort of one single story for too long. They weave, they tangle, they demand you step into their messy corridors. And so, the narrative bends once again, not toward Adonis himself, but toward the way mortals responded to him. Because as much as gods shaped fate, it was people who gave those myths breath, weaving them into rituals, prayers, and sleepless nights under the stars. Picture yourself now, walking into a city alive with festival air, Athens maybe, or Alexandria, or some smaller town perched along the Aegean. It's midsummer, the sun burns bright, yet the people gather not to celebrate abundance, but to mourn. The women carry trays of sprouting greens, each no larger than a child's toy garden. Lettuce, fennel, barley, all bursting in a frantic, almost panicked growth. They've sprouted fast, too fast, drinking greedily of the heat and water, only to wither almost immediately. These are the gardens of Adonis, symbols of life too brief, of beauty that cannot last. The women sing laments as they carry these trays through the streets. Their voices rise in sad, high-pitched tones, not unlike the wails heard at funerals. The air hums with grief, but yet there's something theatrical about it too, something strangely performative. You can imagine a passerby muttering, "They're crying over wilted lettuce? Really?" But of course, it's not about the lettuce. It's about the reminder that life, however brilliant, fades before you can hold on to it. And here's the mainstream fact. Scholars tell us the Adonia festival was likely private, celebrated mostly by women, unlike the grand public ceremonies of Zeus or Athena. It wasn't about civic pride. It was about intimacy, vulnerability, and the shared experience of mourning something fleeting. In that sense, it's one of the most human of festivals, more kitchen table grief than marble temple ritual. For a quirky tidbit, some ancient comic poets, like Aristophanes, mocked these rituals. Imagine the playwright writing jokes about women weeping over potted salads. The plays may have earned laughs in the crowded theaters of Athens, but you can almost hear the audience chuckling while sneaking guilty glances at their wives and mothers. Because ridicule aside, everybody knew loss. And everyone deep down understood what it meant to cry over something that never stood a chance to last. You keep moving through the festival streets in your imagination, lanterns flickering as evening descends. Somewhere a flute plays, its notes wandering like smoke through the alleys. You realize the mourning is not just grief, it's catharsis. The women lament Adonis, yes, but perhaps they also lament their own losses. Lovers gone, children buried too soon, seasons slipping through their fingers. The myth gives them permission to cry, to wail in public, to release what otherwise would remain unspoken. And that's the curious genius of myth. It allows collective grief without explanation. No one asks why the tears fall. Everyone already knows. The story has given shape to something otherwise formless. Let's linger here just a moment longer. Imagine a woman who lost her husband at sea. Each year, she waters her little pot of greens, watches it sprout with startling speed, and then wither, just as her love bloomed quickly and then was gone. For her, Adonis is not a stranger story. He is a mirror. His death is her loss. His return in the myth is the hope she dares not name. Another detail. These gardens were often placed on rooftops, letting the summer heat scorch them faster. So you might picture entire skylines dotted with shallow trays of plants, drying and dying in the sun. From above, it would look like a city covered in miniature cemeteries, each with its own grief story. You could climb onto one of those roofs in your mind, feel the sun still radiating off the clay, smell the faint sweetness of fennel wilted by the day's blaze, and hear a chorus of women's voices drifting up, like a tide of lamentation that never quite reaches shore. Step further, and you notice how these rituals weren't unique. Across the ancient world, other cultures had nearly identical practices. In Mesopotamia, women mourned Tammuz, who died each year with the vegetation, only to rise again. In Egypt, rituals for Osiris echoed the same cycle. It's as if humans, no matter where they lived, needed the reassurance that endings weren't absolute, that beauty, fertility, and even life itself might return. It's almost funny how cultures oceans apart invented the same seasonal soap opera. Different gods, same drama. But let's pause for a moment with an image. The flicker of torches in the warm night, voices drifting upward into the star-freckled sky. You lean against a wall, listening to the strange harmony of laughter, weeping, and whispered prayers. You feel the paradox in your chest. Adonis is gone, and yet Adonis will return. He is forever fleeting, forever renewed. Here's a quirky comparison you probably didn't expect. In modern times, people have compared the gardens of Adonis to those little chia pets, the ones you water, watch sprout, and then, well, they're amusing but short-lived. Only instead of a novelty gift, imagine attaching all your deepest grief to that tiny sprout. Suddenly, the trivial feels monumental. That's what makes these rituals fascinating. Even Plato himself weighed in. He criticized the cult of Adonis, saying it distracted people from serious philosophy, reducing the sacred to shallow spectacle. You can almost picture him rolling his eyes while someone sets out another tray of wilting greens. But perhaps Plato missed the point. Maybe the Adonia wasn't about grand eternal truths. It was about temporary truths, the kind that slip through your fingers. The wilt of the leaf, the ache in your chest, the way grief feels heavy and freeing all at once. Sometimes the temporary matters just as much as the eternal. And maybe that's the quiet lesson for you tonight. Myths are not only about gods and their power games. They're about you, about mortals finding ways to live with impermanence. Whether it's the lettuce wilting on a rooftop or a lover lost too soon, myth offers a language for loss, a stage for sorrow, a rhythm for release. So as the festival fades and the night grows deep, you walk out of the city in your imagination. Behind you, the laments continue, soft as lullabies now. Ahead, the land is quiet again, the moon resting low on the horizon. And you realize that Adonis's story isn't only about a beautiful youth beloved by goddesses. It's about how mortals deal with the certainty that everything beautiful, no matter how radiant, will eventually pass. And yet, in passing, it may return again.
The night air is cooler now, as if the grieving songs of Adonis has faded into the stars, leaving you in a calmer state of mind. You wander further into the mythic landscape, where the roads twist and bend, carrying you toward another story, one tangled with shadow, rebellion, and the dangerous beauty of mortality. The myths have a way of shifting like dreams. One moment you're mourning wilted gardens on rooftops, and the next you find yourself on the edge of a forest where the moon casts fractured light through the branches. The air smells of pine and damp earth, and somewhere ahead you hear a sound that doesn't belong to mortals, a low growl, a warning. You've arrived at the story of Lycaon, the king of Arcadia, a man who, by all accounts, should have known better. He was a ruler, a leader, someone who carried the fate of his people in his hands. And yet his arrogance, or perhaps his curiosity, led him to commit an act so dark that even the gods recoiled. His tale is less about grief and more about the boundaries between man and beast, between reverence and defiance, between civilization and savagery. The mainstream fact: Lycaon is often remembered as the first werewolf. His myth is considered one of the earliest roots of the entire werewolf tradition that later spread through European folklore. When you hear modern stories of full moons and cursed bites, echoes of Lycaon's punishment lie beneath them. It's a fascinating link. Ancient Greece unknowingly planted the seed for centuries of monster lore. But let's return to the man himself. According to the myth, Zeus once descended to Earth in disguise, as he often liked to do. He wanted to test the virtue of mortals, to see if they were worthy of the blessings they so often begged from the heavens. Most hosts, fearing the wrath of the gods, welcome strangers with hospitality: bread, wine, a warm hearth. But not Lycaon. Suspicious of this so-called traveler, or perhaps eager to prove something, Lycaon devised his test of his own. He slaughtered a boy. Some versions say it was his own son, and served the flesh to Zeus at the banquet. It's a grim image, isn't it?
You sitting at the table in that darkened hall, the firelight flickering across the stone walls, watching as Zeus lifts a piece of meat to his lips, his eyes narrowing with divine fury. Even in a sleepy tone, the story has an unsettling edge, because it's not just about horror, it's about violation. Hospitality was sacred in the ancient world. To betray it was to spit in the face of the gods themselves. Now, for a quirky tidbit, in some retellings, Lycaon wasn't alone in this crime. His 50 sons supposedly joined in the deed, a family dinner gone catastrophically wrong. 50 conspirators plotting to trick Zeus. It sounds almost like a bad sitcom premise, if sitcoms included human sacrifice. You can imagine the gods shaking their heads, muttering, "This is why we can't have nice things." The punishment was swift and absolute. Zeus overturned the table, the food scattering across the floor, and with a thunderous roar, he transformed Lycaon into a wolf. His features twisted, his hands became claws, his teeth sharpened, his mind caught somewhere between man and beast. And just like that, the king of Arcadia became the first of a cursed line, the archetype of the werewolf. Picture it. The moon rising over the Arcadian hills, a wolf pacing in the shadows, its eyes glinting with the human's fury. The people whisper, wondering if their king still lurks among the forests, hunting, remembering his old throne but never able to return. That's the haunting beauty of the myth. It doesn't end with death, but with transformation, a punishment that endures night after night. And here's where the myth bleeds into folklore. Across Europe, the idea of humans turning into wolves took on a life of its own. Centuries later, peasants in the Middle Ages whispered about villagers cursed for breaking taboos, wandering forests with fur and fangs. Some even claimed to know families descended from Lycaon himself, carrying the curse through their bloodlines. It's almost comforting, in a strange way, to realize how myths never stay put. They keep wandering, just like wolves.
But pause here for a moment, leaning against an imaginary tree in that Arcadian forest. Listen to the silence broken only by distant howls. Think about what the story is really saying. It's not just about a man punished for arrogance. It's about the fear that beneath all our laws, cities, and rituals, we're still animals. That somewhere deep down, the wildness waits, pacing back and forth, waiting for its chance to break through. And here's a lighter aside to soften the edge. Imagine if Lycaon's story had unfolded in modern times. Zeus drops by in disguise, maybe as a weary traveler at a roadside diner. Lycaon, instead of roasting human flesh, serves up a suspicious meatloaf. Zeus takes one bite, frowns, and suddenly there's a wolf in the corner booth. You can almost hear the waitress muttering, "Great, another one. That's the third this week." The humor doesn't erase the darkness, but it makes the myth more approachable, more human. Because in the end, these stories were meant to be told around firesides, keeping people awake, wary of the shadows. And now, here you are, hearing it in the quiet of your own night, letting the edges soften, the horror turn into a kind of dreamlike blur. As you drift with the story, you realize the myth of Lycaon is less about a singular king and more about the line we all walk, the line between human civility and the wild hunger beneath. His punishment reminds you that the gods demanded respect, but it also whispers a deeper truth. Maybe the beast within is never far away. The forest around you quiets, the howls fading into the distance. The moonlight thickens, silvering the path before you. Ahead, new stories wait, each stranger and more tangled than the last. But for now, you stand still, watching the shadows,
remembering the king who dared to trick a god and paid by becoming a legend that still stalks our imagination. The forest clears slowly, the last howls of Lycaon fading into the night like echoes you can still half hear in your mind. You feel the ground shift beneath your feet, softer now, no longer the dense underbrush of Arcadia, but a gentler meadow. The stars above shimmer as if brighter than before, scattered across the sky like jewels spilled across velvet. It's as though the myths themselves are changing tone, less sharp, less feral, more reflective. And yet, you can't shake the unease left behind. The story of Lycaon lingers, reminding you that even kings can become beasts when arrogance blinds them. But myth, like dreams, are never content to stay in one form. They ripple, overlap, connect in strange ways you don't always expect. From Lycaon's howl, you drift into another tale, one less about punishment and more about transformation through cunning, patience, and the uncanny ability to cross boundaries most mortals couldn't imagine. The man at the heart of this story is Melampus. His name doesn't appear in many school textbooks, and you won't find him starring in Hollywood epics. But his tale is a curious one, full of whispers, laughter, and the strange gift of hearing what others couldn't. Mainstream fact: Melampus was known in Greek mythology as a legendary seer, a man whose insight into the hidden worlds made him invaluable to kings. His reputation was so great that even Herodotus, the historian, credited him with bringing the cult of Dionysus from Egypt to Greece. Think about that. This obscure figure might have been responsible for introducing the god of wine, frenzy, and theater into the Greek pantheon. If you've ever seen a play, raised the glass, or watched chaos unfold at a party, you could jokingly trace it all back to Melampus. But the quirky detail, the part that makes him unforgettable, is how he got his gift. You see, Melampus could speak to animals, not in the cutesy Disney princess way, but through an odd, almost unsettling encounter. The myth tells us that one day he killed a serpent, whose parents, naturally, weren't thrilled. Later, in what feels like cosmic justice, those serpents returned and slithered over his body as he slept. Instead of striking him down, they licked his ears clean, and when he awoke, suddenly, he could hear what birds were saying, understand the chatter of ants, interpret the buzzing of bees. It's absurd and oddly charming. You can imagine him sitting under a tree, nodding along as a sparrow tells him the latest neighborhood gossip. Now pause and imagine being in Melampus's sandals. You're trying to nap, and suddenly two serpents perform an ear-cleaning spa treatment that leaves you fluent in the entire animal kingdom. Not exactly the kind of story you want to explain at parties. Oh, how did I become a seer? Funny story. There were snakes, and, well, you don't want to know. Still, this strange gift made Melampus invaluable. He could interpret omens others missed. Once, when pillars of a house were gnawed by worms, Melampus listened to the insects' complaints and warned the owners before the structure collapsed. Another time, he overheard birds plotting and used their chatter to predict battles. In a world where the line between divine signs and ordinary life was paper thin, Melampus became the man who could straddle both worlds. There's a soft humor in imagining him going about his day, surrounded by a chorus of voices no one else could hear. Birds commenting on the weather, dogs gossiping about the neighbors, even the buzzing of flies carrying secrets. It would be overwhelming in reality, like living with 100 radios turned on at once. But in myth, it became a superpower, the kind of gentle magic that made him both respected and slightly feared. And here's where his tale overlaps with another theme you've seen before: transformation not through punishment, but through strangeness. Unlike Lycaon, Melampus wasn't cursed into a beast. Instead, he bridged the world of humans and animals without losing himself. In many ways, he represents a softer, stranger reflection of Lycaon's fate. One was cast out into the forest, doomed to howl. The other walked into the forest and came back with whispers no one else could hear. But myths are rarely this simple. Melampus's gift didn't just make him a passive listener, it made him powerful in the politics of his time. Kings sought him out for guidance. He negotiated marriages, predicted wars, and in one story, cured the daughters of King Proteus from madness by listening to divine signs. Imagine him standing before a frantic court, shrugging casually and saying, "Don't worry, the doves told me everything will be fine."
Here's the fringe tidbit. Some scholars believe Melampus's story reflects remnants of shamanic traditions, where spiritual leaders were thought to communicate with animals in the natural world. Across cultures, shamans were often described as mediators between human society and the wild, listening to the voices of spirits inhabiting animals. Melampus, then, might not be a random oddball in Greek myth, but a fragment of a much older, pan-human tradition. And that's what makes his story oddly soothing in the middle of the night. Because while Lycaon reminds you of the beast lurking under your skin, Melampus whispers that sometimes the world will grant you strange gifts instead of punishments. That maybe, just maybe, the voices around you, whether they belong to crickets, crows, or cats, are saying more than you think. Let yourself drift with that thought. Picture yourself lying in a quiet meadow, the grass cool beneath you, the stars bright above. Around you, animals stir softly. A fox pads past, its tail brushing the air. An owl watches from a branch, its head cocked to the side. And if you listen closely enough, maybe you hear them, not in words, but in rhythms, in patterns, in whispers that sink into your bones. The night becomes less lonely, less empty, when you imagine every creature carrying a story, waiting for someone like Melampus to listen. And maybe, as you lie there with your eyes half closed, you laugh a little. Because in a way, the myth feels like a bedtime story itself. Odd, whimsical, slightly ridiculous. Serpents licking ears, animals complaining about architecture, kings taking advice from bird watchers. It's strange, it's sleepy, and it's exactly the kind of tale that lulls you into the softer edges of imagination. So when you close your eyes, think of Melampus not as a grand hero or a cursed villain, but as a gentle reminder that sometimes the strangest gifts are the ones that matter most. That even in the quiet of the night, surrounded by silence, you're never entirely alone. The world hums, breathes, whispers. And maybe tonight, you'll catch just a fragment of its hidden conversation.
The meadow fades behind you, soft grass dissolving into shadows, and suddenly you're walking along a quiet road that seems older than time itself. The stars above dim, replaced by the faint flicker of torches lining the way. They sputter as though tired, each flame struggling to hold its place in the windless night. The path leads forward, and you follow, your steps echoing gently until the world around you shifts once again. Here, the myths weave a different fabric, less whimsical than Melampus, less savage than Lycaon, but no less strange. You're entering the realm of transformations that linger in the background of Greek storytelling, the kind that make you pause and wonder just how much of these tales were meant as entertainment and how much as whispered warnings. Tonight, the myth drifting towards you is one of tangled trees, unbearable longing, and a name you might not have heard before, Myrrha. Or sometimes she's called Smyrna. Her story doesn't appear in the grand epics. Homer doesn't sing about her. Hesiod barely glances her way. Yet, tucked into later retellings, you find this tragic tale, one that explains why a certain fragrant tree bleeds resin like tears. Mainstream fact: Myrrha's myth was widely known in antiquity, especially during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The substance, myrrh, was prized in the ancient world, using perfumes, incense, and even embalming practices. Kings stockpiled it, priests burnt it, and merchants carried it along trade routes that stretched from Arabia to the Mediterranean. So naturally, people asked, where did myrrh come from? And like so many natural substances, the Greeks didn't settle for a botanical explanation, they gave it a story. The myth goes like this. Myrrha, cursed by the gods, fell into an unnatural love for her father, King Cinyras of Cyprus. Whether this curse came from the Furies, the gods, or divine vengeance varies from version to version, but the heart of it is the same, an impossible desire that would destroy her. For 12 nights, disguised and desperate, she slipped into her father's bed. When the truth came out, Cinyras chased her with a sword, ready to kill her for the shame she brought. Myrrha fled, begging the gods for deliverance. And the gods, in their cruel mercy, transformed her into a tree. From her bark, drops of resin trickled, tears hardened into the fragrant gum we still call myrrh. Now, before you shift uncomfortably, let's ease the edges of this myth. You're not meant to focus on the grim details while trying to drift off. Instead, think about it like this. For the Greeks, the world was alive with stories. Even trees had pasts. A grove wasn't just timber waiting for an axe. It was a collection of lives, memories, curses, and prayers. When you walked past a myrrh tree, its perfume wafting through the air, you weren't smelling sap. You were breathing the remnants of a myth. Here's the quirky tidbit. The resin of the myrrh tree was literally described in antiquity as the tears of Myrrha. Poets leaned heavily on that imagery. Later Roman writers, like Ovid in his Metamorphoses, made the connection explicit, turning her grief into something tangible. So when Roman matrons burned myrrh in their homes, or when it was carried in funerary rites, it wasn't just fragrance. It was myth woven into daily life. Imagine lighting a candle today, and with it comes not just a scent, but the memory of an ancient princess transformed into flame. There's also something oddly soothing about the tree imagery itself. Picture Myrrha frozen mid-flight, her skin hardening into bark, her fingers stretching into branches, her tears dripping as resin. In myth, transformation often carries a sense of release. Daphne turned into a laurel to escape Apollo. Narcissus dissolved into a flower to escape his reflection. Myrrha became a tree to escape her torment. Painful, yes, but also eternal. Instead of fading into nothing, she became something the world could still touch, smell, and remember. And out of that tree, a child was born. The bark cracked, and from the trunk emerged Adonis, the most beautiful mortal the world had ever seen. Yes, this is the same Adonis who would one day capture the heart of Aphrodite herself, sparking jealousy and rivalry among gods. So in a sense, Myrrha's tragedy gave birth to beauty. It's one of those contradictions Greek myths specialize in. Suffering leading to something the world treasures, like light cutting through shadow. Now, pause. Let yourself sink into that image. A quiet grove under the night sky. A single tree standing tall, resin glistening on its bark like amber tears. The air is heavy with the scent of myrrh, sweet and bitter all at once. There's no chase anymore, no curse, no frantic running, only stillness. You sit at the base of the tree, feeling its cool surface, and you sense that even in sorrow, there's rest. Even in transformation, there's peace. If Melampus was the listener and Lycaon the howler, Myrrha is the weeper, the myth that turns grief into fragrance, pain into permanence. And while the story may sound unsettling when told in sharp detail, It softens when you think of it as a meditation on endurance. She endured by becoming something unchanging, rooted, fragrant. Her myth reminds you that not every escape is about running farther. Sometimes escape is about transforming into something the world cannot chase. Another curious layer, myrrh, the substance itself, plays a role in religious and spiritual traditions long after Greece. It appears in the Bible as one of the gifts of the Magi to the newborn Christ: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. It's burned in temples, used in healing balms, mixed into sacred oils. The tears of a mythic girl from Cyprus ended up perfuming both Greek sacrifices and Christian altars. A strange continuity, isn't it? One of those bridges across time that makes you realize myths never really die. They just change their names. As you sit with that thought, the grove around you sways gently. The branches hum like a lullaby. You close your eyes and the air is rich, layered, complex. Sweetness with a trace of bitterness, like the stories themselves. And in that mix, you hear the gods whispering their quiet reminder: all things transform. Kings into wolves, men into seers, girls into trees. And maybe you too, in the space between waking and sleep, transform just a little, slipping into dreams, letting go of one shape to enter another. You step away from the grove where Myrrha's tree stands, its fragrant tears drifting like incense into the cool night air. The road beneath your feet stretches forward again, and the torches return, their flames steady now, glowing like sleepy eyes keeping watch. The world feels quieter here, less tangled in pain, more like a gentle bridge carrying you from one myth to the next. Your journey through obscure tales has taken you from animals whispering to a man, to a king howling beneath the moon, to a tree weeping its perfume into history. Each myth has left its mark. Each myth has reshaped the landscape around you. Now, as you wander deeper, you notice a hill rising in the distance. The slope is smooth, pale under starlight, and at its summit stands a solitary statue. The figure is cloaked in shadow, yet its outline suggests sorrow mixed with reverence. When you climb closer, you realize the figure carved in stone is neither god nor beast, but something in between, an echo of humanity caught in divine punishment. This place whispers of the countless other transformations scattered across Greek myth, stories not as famous as Zeus or Athena, but no less powerful in the way they shaped how ancient people thought about the world around them. Mainstream fact: transformation or metamorphosis was one of the most recurring themes in Greek mythology, later popularized by the Roman poet Ovid in his work Metamorphosis. From Daphne turning into a laurel tree to Niobe becoming stone after losing her children, these stories explained natural phenomena while also serving as moral lessons or warnings. They gave shape to rivers, flowers, animals, even constellations. To live in the Greek world was to believe that every rock, every stream, every plant could hold a secret past, a myth etched into nature itself. But here's the quirky tidbit. Some transformations were far stranger than the famous ones. Take the story of Arachne, for example. You probably know her, the weaver who challenged Athena and got turned into a spider. But did you know that in some versions, she didn't weave just for pride? She wove to reveal the gods' scandals. Her tapestries showed Zeus sneaking around, disguising himself to seduce mortals, all the messy divine affairs the Olympians wanted swept under the rug. Athena wasn't just punishing arrogance, she was punishing truth-telling. And so, the spider's web became a symbol not only of skill, but of dangerous honesty, something spun quietly in the dark. Think of that the next time you brush away a spider web in a corner. You're erasing a mythic warning that the gods prefer their secrets hidden. The Greeks didn't need horror movies. They just looked at a spider and thought, ah yes, a cursed woman who dared to outdo a goddess. Not exactly bedtime friendly, but perfect for the kind of eerie calm that slips you further toward drowsiness. Another overlooked transformation, Anaxarete, a Cypriot maiden who mocked the love of a humble shepherd named Iphis. He pined for her, begged her, and when she refused, he hanged herself in despair. Anaxarete watched his funeral procession without shedding a tear. The gods, unimpressed with her coldness, turned her into stone. That statue, legend claimed, could still be seen in Salamis centuries later. Imagine walking through a city and seeing what looks like just another weather-worn carving, only to hear someone whisper, "That was a girl once." That's what happens when you mock love. Suddenly, stone isn't so lifeless. It's a warning set in marble. As you climb higher on the hill, the statue you saw earlier shifts before your eyes, cycling between forms. A woman, a spider, a block of stone. It's as though the myths themselves are layering together, reminding you that transformation was never just a punishment, it was permanence. Mortals faded, trees, rocks, and rivers lasted. To become part of the landscape was to endure longer than memory. It's soothing if you think about it. You walk through the woods, and the stream trickling by might be a nymph who once wept herself into water. The flower blooming at your feet might be Hyacinthus, struck down in a tragic accident with Apollo's discus. Even the constellations overhead, Orion striding across the sky, Callisto shining as Ursa Major, are myths frozen in time, sparkling above you as you drift into sleep. Another fringe tidbit, in ancient rituals, certain plants were treated with special reverence because of their mythic origins. The laurel, sacred to Apollo, wasn't just a pretty tree, it was Daphne, forever fleeing his embrace. Breaking a branch carelessly wasn't just vandalism, it was sacrilege. Imagine living in a world where picking flowers felt like stepping into someone's myth. Even sleep itself was tied to transformation. Hypnos, the god of sleep, was often depicted with wings, ready to carry you away from one state of being into another. Closing your eyes wasn't just rest, it was metamorphosis. As the torchlight flickers, you feel yourself transforming too. Not into a tree or an animal or a star, but into something softer, calmer. The road beneath you seems to blur, edges smoothing out like clay under gentle hands. You're not just walking, you're being reshaped, molded into stillness. And in that stillness, the myths stop being stories about ancient people long ago. They become mirrors for your own quiet transformations. The way stress dissolves when you exhale, the way thought fades as you drift closer to dreams. The statue at the top of the hill finally steadies. It no longer shifts between forms, but rests as a tree with branches spread wide, resin glistening like stars. You know it's Myrrha, standing watch, her sorrow transformed into fragrance that lingers even here. She's not alone, though. Around her are hints of other transformations, stone fragments that whisper of Anaxarete, a delicate thread of web floating in the torchlight that belongs to Arachne. Each myth is here, layered, waiting, reminding you that nothing is ever truly lost. Everything changes shape. Everything continues in some form. And as you settle beneath that tree, the breeze is filled with scents and sounds that no longer frighten you. The myths aren't curses anymore. They're lullabies. The weaver spins a soft web above your head. The stone statue hums with quiet endurance. And the tree drips with fragrant tears that smell faintly of spice and smoke. You close your eyes, and you realize that the greatest transformation of all is happening now. The shift from waking into sleep, from story into dream. The torches dim as you rest under the myrrh tree, the air thick with resin and the faint hum of unseen voices. When you open your eyes again, the path before you has shifted into something new. The stones beneath your feet are smoother, polished by centuries of footsteps, as though every myth you've just walked through has been compacted into a single winding road. The night sky above glitters with constellations, Orion, Cassiopeia, Ursa Major, each one pulsing faintly like living eyes watching from above. You realize the myths of transformation you've wandered through are not only etched into trees and rivers, but also into the very heavens. This section of your journey feels quieter, yet more expansive. It's not just about one figure or one punishment. It's about the collective weight of myths, how they spread like ripples across time. You're not standing in Greece anymore. The path has stretched far wider, carrying with it echoes from other lands, other cultures. For while the Greeks gave their myths the form of trees and stones, other peoples gave theirs the breath of fire, the howl of wolves, the flicker of ghostly lights. And all of it, when listened to at this late hour, folds neatly into the same lullaby. Stories meant to explain the world and, by explaining it, soothe the mind before sleep. Mainstream fact. Constellations, for instance, were one of the oldest storytelling canvases humans ever used. Long before Netflix marathons, people looked at the night sky and saw entire dramas unfolding overhead. For the Greeks, these constellations tied directly to myths. Callisto transformed into a bear and then into Ursa Major. Andromeda chained to a rock until Perseus rescued her, now forever fixed in stars. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were orientation tools, calendars, and cultural memory all woven into one. Look up, and you could remember planting times, migration seasons, or which direction led home. Myth and science weren't separate. They were twins staring at the same sky. But here's a quirky tidbit. Not every culture read the stars the same way. To the Greeks, the constellation of Scorpius was the scorpion sent to kill Orion. But to the Polynesians, those same stars mapped out fishing hooks, canoes, and journeys across the Pacific. So imagine a Greek sailor and a Polynesian navigator sitting under the same night sky. One sees Orion striding across the heavens, fated to flee the sting of a scorpion. The other sees the outline of a canoe, guiding them safely across the ocean. Same stars, totally different bedtime story. Makes you wonder how many versions of the night sky you're missing just by sticking to one culture's myth. The path beneath you glimmers faintly now, like it's paved with stardust. Every step echoes not on stone, but in your chest, as though you're walking through memory itself. You glance to your left and see a river winding lazily down the hillside, but the water doesn't reflect the moon. Instead, it reflects a parade of faces, heroes, nymphs, mortals, and monsters, all gliding past in silence. These are the forgotten figures of myth, the ones who never made it into the popular textbooks or tourist brochures. They are shadows, yes, but not silent. You can almost hear them, whispering their names into the current, hoping someone will remember. And this is where the myths feel most alive, because memory itself is fragile. Take Lycaon, for example. Most people just know him as the first werewolf, but buried in some older fragments, his story is stranger. Some versions say only one of his 50 sons was spared by Zeus, that line later giving rise to entire tribes who carried the name Arcadians. In other words, Lycaon wasn't just a horror story, he was an origin story. His punishment wasn't only about cannibalism and outrage, it explained why some people were different, why some groups claimed descent from wolves. Myths doubled as anthropology, passed down in whispers and fireside tales. And then there's Myrrha. Most retellings end with her transformation into the tree, but a few obscure variations mention that her son, Adonis, grew up beloved not only by Aphrodite, but also Persephone. In one version, the two goddesses fought over him so fiercely that Zeus had to intervene, splitting his time between them. It's a messy love triangle, but the important detail is this. Myrrha's suffering wasn't erased. It birthed beauty. Adonis became the embodiment of renewal, of the cycle of life and death tied to the seasons. Out of despair bloomed rebirth. Out of resin tears, a boy who embodied spring itself. You lean against the myrrh tree once more, realizing how many layers each story holds. They aren't fixed in stone. They're rivers, branching, flowing, changing with every retelling. And the further you listen, the more you notice how the boundaries between cultures blur. Lycaon's transformation into a wolf has echoes in Norse tales of Fenrir, the monstrous wolf destined to swallow the world at Ragnarok. Myrrha's tragic transformation parallels stories in Sumerian and Mesopotamian myth, where mortals who offended gods were turned into trees, stones, or birds. Even Melampus, with his animal speech, has cousins in Celtic folklore, where druids were said to understand the language of stags, owls, and even rivers. Here's the soothing part. If every culture tells the same kinds of stories, then you're not really drifting through strange lands. You're always home, no matter which myth you're listening to. Myths become lullabies shared by humanity, the same themes whispered under different stars. Transformation, love, punishment, rebirth, they repeat like the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore. The torches sway as if nodding in agreement, and the breeze carries new scents: pine, honey, salt from the faraway sea. You can almost hear the hush of waves, the creak of ancient ships, the lull of oars dipping into water. It's the sound of myths traveling, being carried from one port to another, reshaped by each storyteller who passed them along. Another fringe detail drifts into your thoughts. Some ancient myths were literally used as lullabies. Fragments of Greek lullaby hymns survive, where mothers soothed children with soft references to the gods. "Sleep, my child," they might murmur, as Selene rides the night sky and the stars keep their watch. Even in antiquity, myth wasn't just grand battles and divine punishments. It was comfort, whispered to help little ones close their eyes. In a way, what you're listening to now isn't new. It's part of an ancient ritual, stretching back thousands of years. You keep walking, though slower now, your feet dragging as though the road itself wants you to linger. The constellations above shimmer brighter. The faces in the river fade into still water. And the statue of Myrrha on the hill is now just a tree, quietly releasing its fragrance. You sense that the road is almost done, that you've nearly reached the place where myths dissolve into dreams. And yet, you don't feel an ending. You feel continuity, as though every myth, obscure or famous, is part of the same endless story, one that will keep going long after you've drifted into sleep. Your eyelids grow heavier, the torchlight softens into faint glows like fireflies, and the wind itself feels like a hand tucking a blanket around your shoulders. The myths no longer demand to be heard. They hum quietly, patiently, ready to carry you the rest of the way without effort. All you have to do is let go. The path narrows now, almost imperceptibly, as though the world itself is ushering you toward rest. The starlight above melts into a softer glow, no longer sharp points, but gentle halos, like lanterns wrapped in mist. The torches lining the road sputter and go out one by one,
Not suddenly, but in a sequence so smooth, it feels as if the darkness itself is tucking you in. You don't need their light anymore, not after everything you've seen, not after all the faces of myth that have trailed beside you like shadows of memory. Your footsteps are slower now, padded, muffled, as though you're walking not on stone, but on velvet. The stories behind you linger in the air like the faint echo of a lullaby. Myrrha, still fragrant in her sorrow, Lycaon forever caught between man and wolf. Melampus, laughing quietly with the animals only he understands. They don't follow you, they simply remain, part of the path, threads in the endless tapestry that stretches backward and forward across time. And here you are, at the edge of that tapestry. It doesn't feel like an ending. Endings are abrupt, jarring. This feels more like drifting into another current, like a boat sliding from a wide river into a calmer stream. The voices that once demanded your attention now hum faintly, like bees in a distant meadow, steady, soothing, fading, but never gone. Mainstream fact drifts in gently, like the soft breath of wind. Myths are not static. Even in antiquity, they shifted, changed, adapted to the needs of the people telling them. The Greeks weren't just preserving stories, they were reshaping them with each generation. And that tradition never stopped. Every retelling, every whisper in the dark, every classroom lecture or casual bedtime story, it's all part of the same living current. What you've walked through tonight isn't a museum of myths, frozen and dead. It's a living stream, carrying you forward.
And here's a quirky tidbit to lull you deeper. In the Middle Ages, monks copying Greek texts would sometimes doodle in the margins. Little sketches of animals, caricatures of fellow monks, or even tiny scenes unrelated to the main text. Imagine it. You've got the tragic tale of Myrrha written in careful ink, and right beside it, a monk has drawn a cat playing with a mouse, or a man pulling a silly face. Even in the midst of solemn work, the human impulse to play, to soften, to ease into humor persisted. Those doodles are proof that people, no matter the century, always sought balance between weight and levity. A reminder that even the heaviest myths were told under starlight with laughter nearby. The path now leads you through a field of tall grass, the stalks swaying gently against your arms, whispering as you pass. The sound is like silk sheets rustling, like pages turning, like the faintest applause for simply reaching this point. The grass parts, and before you stretches a horizon that seems impossibly wide. But it's not intimidating, it's comforting. A space big enough for rest, a space large enough to hold dreams. The constellations overhead soften further. You watch as Orion slowly dissolves into a mist of faint silver. Scorpius fades into a line of floating embers, and Cassiopeia blurs into something more like drifting candlelight. The myths in the sky are dimming because they don't need you anymore tonight. They've done their job. They've walked you here. You sit down now, the grass cool beneath your palms, the earth steady against your back. The world hums quietly, not with tension, but with release. The torchlight in your memory has gone. The air no longer carries resin, wolf howls, or whispers of languages only a few could hear. Instead, it carries one simple scent: night air. Calm, clean, quiet. You close your eyes, and the stories reassemble themselves not as tragedies or warnings, but as soft fragments of imagery. The shimmer of a wolf's fur under moonlight, the gleam of sap on a tree trunk, the tilt of a bird's head as it speaks in a voice you almost understand. These aren't demands for your attention anymore. They're gentle ripples that carry you into rest. And now your breathing slows. Each inhale stretches longer, filling you with the cool quiet of night. Each exhale releases the weight of the myths you've carried. The world becomes lighter. The grass bends around you like a cradle, and the night wraps itself close, as if the universe itself is tucking you in. The voices of gods and monsters are gone, replaced by silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of promise, of continuity, of the knowledge that the myths will still be here tomorrow, waiting, patient, timeless. So, you let go. You let go of the path, of the torchlight, of the faces and rivers and the stars in the sky. You let go of Lycaon's howl, of Myrrha's tears, of Melampus's laughter with creatures unseen. They are not lost. They're simply background now, blending into the gentle rhythm of your breath, the cadence of your slowing heart, the steady unfolding of sleep. You are safe here. You are carried here. You are allowed to rest here. And as you drift further, the final truth folds itself around you like a blanket. No myth ever truly ends. It softens, it changes, it waits for another telling. And so, too, your story tonight does not end. It pauses, rests, settles into the quiet. Now, let your thoughts dissolve into nothing more than warmth and breath. Let the myths blur into dreams. Let the night cradle you, whispering not in words, but in the language of silence. The story has slowed. The road has disappeared. Only rest remains. Sleep now. Sleep deeply. Sleep knowing that myths guard the thresholds of your dreams, that every whisper tonight carries you further into calm. Sleep knowing the story continues, but you don't need to follow it anymore. You have reached the quiet, and the quiet belongs to you. Sweet dreams.